Our story begins with a little boy telling his father about a girl who was really tiny. He felt like it'd only take one puff of air to knock her over, and the young man agrees, explaining that's exactly why they needed to be extra careful not to hurt the girl. Another boy starts asking about who the little girl actually was, but he's cut off when she opens her eyes herself. Confused, she gets startled hearing someone call her Cotton Ball and ask if she was awake. She had no idea where she was in the end. Then the older young man said she was at the palace of the White Tiger family, who guarded the east of the kingdom of Toa. Just like that, the man mentions that he himself had stolen her from her home country, and dread washes over the girl's face. That's when she remembered that, the night before, she had been taken by that man, who didn't seem to have the slightest hint of remorse in his eyes. The kingdom of Toa was inhabited by hybrid mutants, ruled by the imperial family, and protected by 4 exceptional clans: the Azure Dragon of the West, the White Tigers of the East, the Red Birds of the South, and the Black Turtles of the North. Having inherited the blood of divine sacred beasts, they controlled their lands and all the mutants living there. Meanwhile, on the south side, a buzz was spreading about how the clan leader had come there in person. People were saying he never let his youngest daughter out of his sight and carried her around with so much affection. Everyone looked on enchanted by that family, while the little white-haired girl stayed in her father's arms, who asked if Joksoya was ready. She confirms, excited. Her brother asks her not to be nervous, since everything would work out fine. Apparently, she was deeply loved by the family, and she was determined to always do her best so she wouldn't disappoint them. Joksoya was the precious youngest daughter of the Redbird clan, and starting her incantation, the girl shimmered through the space, focusing while wishing that just like her father, she could turn into a beautiful red bird with dazzling feathers. This happened when she was 5-6 years old, until she transformed for the first time into a bird very different from what was expected, a little white ball that looked like a cloud. Suddenly, the people who'd been so amazed by her presence seemed to shudder at the sight of the girl's white furred/feathers, saying that a red bird needed to have red feathers. It didn't take long for people to start gossiping about the rumors that had been going around the castle when the youngest was born. 7 years earlier, a child had finally been born into the Redbird clan, but the moment she was born, her mother died, and the only witness had been the midwife. The maids commented on something strange about the baby. Her hair was completely white, and the child cried non-stop. That shouldn't have been possible, since neither of her parents had white hair. Something had to be wrong. That's when one girl suggested that maybe Joksoya was an illegitimate child, or who knows, maybe she'd been swapped. But her husband didn't think so. On the contrary, he insisted his late wife was purer than snow itself, and roared that no one should ever question her virtue and her chastity. Within that mutant society, a person's bloodline was the single most important thing to anyone. That's because all of a person's power came from that direct bloodline, especially when it came to the 4 guardian clans, who were exceptionally strong and distinct from any other animals. And to preserve the purity of that power, the family's principal wife was sealed with magic after her wedding. That's why Joksoya's father, Jok Ayun, simply assumed that one of his wife's ancestors had had white hair, and spent a good while believing his daughter's white hair wouldn't be a problem, repeating to her, with tears in his eyes, that on the day of her first transformation, her redbird bloodline would be proven through her shining red feathers. But that was very different from what was happening in that moment. The little bird approaches her father's feet, a bit awkwardly, but is quickly struck by her father, who was in complete shock at having his expectations totally shattered. The people around didn't quite know what to do. They were disappointed for sure, but they hadn't expected an attitude like that from Jok Ayun. And what he did next was even worse, saying they should destroy that child's animal spirit and lock her in the ice palace. The little one couldn't believe what was happening and couldn't say anything because of the transformation. With hatred in his eyes, the man went on, making it clear he wouldn't forgive anyone who mentioned what happened there that day. Our poor protagonist didn't know why he was looking at her so coldly, until she glanced at the floor and noticed a white feather there. That was strange. Why weren't there red feathers fallen there, like her father's or her brother's? The little one soon started blaming herself, thinking she'd failed her transformation. Maybe that's why her father was so disappointed. Worry took over her face when her brother Jack approached, looking just as worried as their father, but that lit a spark of hope in the girl. Maybe he could help her. However, the young man cast a spell on his sister, making her cry out in pain. The little one's animal spirit's blue orb glowed in his hand with a chilling aura, which made the girl quickly return to her human form. With a trembling voice, she asked why he was doing that, but was immediately scolded by the young man, who asked who she thought she was calling brother. The girl couldn't calm down, repeating that if she could just try again, she'd surely succeed. But Juk didn't seem to care about her words, since an evil look took over his face as he said the girl was very clever for trying to fool them all this time, and warned that she should never show her face to him again, because if he saw it, he'd rip off her pathetic white wing with his own hands. And that's how our girl ended up trapped in the ice palace, like she was nothing at all because she had feathers as white as cotton. Even with so much contempt, the girl prayed, hoping she'd manage to succeed in her transformation, since she believed her father and brother would smile at her again if that happened. But all that effort just kept leading her to more and more frustration. Her brother had ripped the animal spirit out of her, and she was sure that, without it, she'd never be able to use her transformation powers again. Juksoya knew that for a fact, but to win back her father and brother's hearts, the only thing the little girl could do was keep trying to transform, even if it hurt her own body. And it hurt a lot. On one of those days, while sleeping in the ice palace, she heard the staff commenting that the rumors about her feathers were true. One of them wondered if that really meant she was the daughter of Jukayun's late wife with some other man. Honestly, the maids didn't know why she kept living at the palace, since in her place, they'd have already kicked the girl out to the streets long ago. But her friends scolded her, saying someone might overhear and that the clan had ordered them to keep it secret. But they couldn't help being cruel, saying that child was the disgrace of the Red Bird clan. The poor girl heard it all, accepting that she really wasn't her father's true daughter, until, 3 years later, the girl was tending to her clothes. She knew she needed to hurry inside and change clothes quickly. By that point, everyone had already practically forgotten that the Red Bird clan had once received a firstborn daughter. A girl holds a red feather, introducing herself as Lily. Apparently, the clan's real daughter had returned, surprising Jukayun and Juk. The little girl continues her introduction, explaining she was 9 years old and had recently transformed for the first time, and the people who saw her feathers said she could find her real family there. Jukayun stared at her, still not quite knowing what to say, but then he started asking why she was carrying that little thing around instead of transforming right in front of him, if the feather really belonged to her, which seems to throw the redhead off balance. She couldn't even answer because the young man was already shouting, questioning why he should trust her, and the girl comments, nervously, that she could transform right in front of him, no problem, and so she does, invoking the beast's transformation. The form Lily takes leaves the young man and everyone around him with their jaws dropped. There was no doubt about it. She was a direct descendant of the Red Bird clan. The girl quickly transformed back into her human form. She seemed exhausted and was quickly caught by the man, who called her his daughter. She explains that the core of her spirit was very weak, so doing these transformations too often ended up straining her heart. According to her, she'd spent her childhood very sick, but hadn't received proper treatment in time, and that's why she'd turned out this way. With her eyes filling with tears, Lily apologizes, commenting that she'd been a child who couldn't even transform properly, but was quickly reassured. Because, in a warm hug, Jukayun made it clear that it was his fault for not having recognized her sooner. A week later, the girl was walking around commenting how happy she was to finally have a father and a brother. Right after finishing that sentence, she asked, worried, if it was okay to call Jukayun father. Of course he saw nothing wrong with that. In fact, he thanked her for her kindness, as did her new brother Juk. That's when our girl came across this girl, realizing she was calling the two of them father and brother, so she was the firstborn everyone had been talking about. Jukayun and Juk's faces looked brighter than ever, something that left our girl a bit sad, because she couldn't remember seeing that much joy on their faces in a long time. It didn't take long for Lily to notice the little girl's presence and ask who she was. Before she could say anything, Juk already jumped in, saying she was just another kid who worked for them, and there was no need to bother with her. Lily put her hand to her nose, commenting that it seemed like she didn't even bathe properly, since she smelled awful. That was just one more of the humiliations Juksoya had to go through there. They hurry the new favorite along, asking her not to worry about someone of such a low rank, but Lily asks them to wait a moment, revealing that she wanted to keep that little girl by her side and asking that they let her become her main servant. Not knowing whether they could reveal the truth or not, Juk commented that the girl was very small, so it'd be very hard for her to carry out the tasks, but he'd find someone to serve her. The problem is, Lily stomped her foot like a spoiled child, insisting once again that she wanted Juksoya, and even argued that the bad smell would go away as soon as she took a good bath. Their father finally speaks up, and contrary to what you might expect, he let the girl have exactly what she wanted, making the girl cheer and say he was the best father in the world. Worried, Juk jumped in, mentioning to remind his father who that little girl was. Except it wasn't Jukayun's intention for his daughter to know the truth, so he just argued that Lily had chosen her and should have her wishes granted, so they took the poor protagonist with them. Honestly, the man was very surprised to see so much joy on the child's face, who was happier than a pig in mud with her new servant, but Juksoya, on the other hand, looked desperate. The redhead comments that when she lived on the street, she had no one by her side, no child her own age to play with. Actually, everyone looked at her with pity and bothered her, saying she was nothing but an orphan. These memories left Jukayun furious that his daughter had once been treated that way. Wrapping up the topic, he asks Lily and her brother to excuse him for a moment, something the girl finds a bit odd, since it meant the servant would be left alone with her father, but she does as told. When the two of them were finally alone, Jukayun mentioned it had been a while since they'd last spoken, and he made it clear he wouldn't waste his words, because by this point, the girl should already know her place there. Then the man revealed that the protagonist's mother, who'd served as a mere helper, had probably swapped the two of them at the maternity ward. And if that was true, that was the reason Lily had been forced to live on the streets so early. reaffirming that everything that was rightfully hers had been taken from her hands by the daughter of some random servant. Such accusations made Juksoya's eyes go wide, and her father declared imposingly that now that his true daughter had returned to the palace, if she wanted anything at all, he'd do everything to give it to her, even if he had to turn against everyone else to do it. Hearing the young man call her my daughter made our girl's chest ache. She remembered how she used to be treated with affection, but now the emperor's true daughter was Lily, and she no longer meant anything to the man, who continued his speech, saying she shouldn't let Lily find out her true identity, and warned that if the little one got hurt because of her, he would never forgive her. With her head hanging down, trying to hold back tears, the protagonist just agreed to his requests. A month had passed since the true protégé returned to the palace, and it was time for her 9th birthday. The place was full of gifts, and the maids were doing her hair, chatting about the 15th royal prince, who was the only legitimate heir of the imperial family. Apparently, he'd be attending to discuss a possible marriage with Lily, which would mean the little lady would become the Yellow Dragon's bride. That possibility made the girl smile, even as she commented it was too good a title for her. But she was soon showered with flattery from the maids, who commented that it wasn't too good at all. Just take one look at that gorgeous hair, a perfect color mixed with gold, which only direct descendants of the Red House possessed. No one could imitate it. The girl's attention is caught seeing Juksoya walking by behind her with her gifts, so she made a point of calling her over to ask her opinion, which catches our girl a bit off guard. She looks at Lily with a certain reluctance in her eyes, and the girl trembles, trying not to drop everything, but answers that the true heir was very beautiful. Meanwhile, outside, the imperial carriage arrives, and the little boy greets the Juk patriarch, commenting it had been a long time since they'd last seen each other. This was the 15th royal prince of the kingdom of Tairin. He was warmly welcomed by Lily, who formally introduced herself, along with her brother, welcoming him to the land of the Red Bird. Alongside the maids, Juksoya was impressed by the imperial prince's presence. It was the first time she'd seen anyone so beautiful, and for a second their eyes met, making our girl's eyes go wide. She quickly bowed, trying to hide her flushed face at having been caught admiring the young man's beauty. It didn't take long for one of the servants to suggest the protagonist was trying to get Yirim's attention somehow, which was absurd. She'd already stolen Lady Lily's place before, and now she wanted to steal her suitor too? But that hadn't even crossed the girl's mind. Thinking about it, the servants locked her in a dark room, making her bang on the door desperately, apologizing non-stop because she didn't want to be in there. However, it had already been decided among the servants that she'd stay there until Lily's birthday party was over. The adults mocked her, questioning whether trying to steal Lily's place in the line of succession hadn't been enough for her, that now she wanted to be buddies with the prince too, reaffirming that the girl needed to understand her place there. Inside, Juksoya could only cry. She had no bad intentions and was so tired of all of it. She didn't know how much time had passed, but the moon had already taken over the sky. The little girl felt her stomach ache from not having eaten all day, and she felt sad because no one else there even knew she'd gone missing. And it only made her feel even more depressed to remember the first time she ended up in that terrible cell, because, just like back then, no one had gone looking for her to see if she was alive. That's when she heard someone calling her name, and a spark of hope lit up in her chest. The doors opened quickly, revealing the image of her savior. The young man is surprised at the girl's whereabouts, explaining he'd been searching for her everywhere. That surprises Juksoya, who thought something like that seemed unlikely. It was Prince Yirim, right in front of her, with those deep eyes, as if he felt affection for the girl, even without having known her. Nervous, she asks how the boy had gotten there, and, more importantly, how he even knew her name, given she was just some random servant. He picks up an ornament and holds it out to the protagonist, asking if she really didn't remember him, even after showing her that. That's when the memories flooded back into our girl's mind. 3 years earlier, when she went to visit the imperial palace to send her older brother off to war, she'd ended up meeting a young master who was in mourning after losing his mother, sitting alone in the garden. His name was Yirim, and even though she didn't know much about him, it seemed like he actually lived at the palace. The girl sat down beside him, holding out the ornament, explaining that her mother had left it to her, and that every time she missed her, all she had to do was look at it and she'd feel better. She explains it was very precious, but she wanted the little boy to find strength somewhere, so she'd lend it to him. The mourning prince tried to argue that it belonged to the girl's late mother and he couldn't just keep something so important. Thinking about it, Juksoya suggested that once he felt better and the sadness had passed, he could give it back to her. That was a surprise, maybe the first genuine kindness the boy had received in a very long time. So, with a faint smile, he promised he'd return it once things had settled. The two of them sealed the promise with their little fingers linked together, and that was official enough. Now, without a veil covering his face, Yirim answered that he'd come there to fulfill what he'd promised her. Juksoya was surprised to realize that was the same grieving little boy she'd met so long ago. He mentions he'd been worried he'd arrived too late, but was very happy to be able to declare that day had finally ended. Even as he talked about the promise, Juksoya's head was still confused because she couldn't believe the young man had been the prince this whole time. Finally, the little boy wished Juksoya a happy birthday. She hadn't even noticed she'd forgotten. She'd been so focused on Lily's 9th birthday that she'd forgotten it was also her own day. So she burst into tears, unable to hold it in. The protagonist apologizes, explaining she didn't mean to cry like that. It's just that she was feeling really happy. And Yirim looked a bit worried, before breaking into a smile when she thanked him, calling him Your Highness. And the young man explained she didn't need to do that. She could just call him like she always used to. More than anything, he wanted to understand what had happened to the girl, because she seemed very different from how he remembered her the one time they'd met. She'd been so happy and dressed in such elegant clothes, and now sadness seemed to have taken over her soul. So he wanted her to tell him what happened, and so our girl did. She told the prince every detail, without hiding anything. The little young man falls into thought for a moment. Apparently that was what had happened on her first transformation day, but he still didn't think it was possible. Until an idea hit him. He suddenly gets up, alarming the girl. Without much explanation, Yirim explains he needed to go back to the Imperial Palace immediately to check on something. And noticing the girl's face darkening again, he asked her not to be sad, promising he'd come back soon, while holding out his little finger like the other time. And, kneeling in front of Juksoya, he made it clear that when he came back, he'd take her with him to the Imperial Palace, at least if she'd allow that to happen. The two of them just didn't know that someone else had been interested in that conversation. Lily, outside, stunned by everything she'd heard. She couldn't believe how that girl had come up with such a low scheme to make the prince say he'd come back just for her. Ever since she'd arrived there, she'd hated Juksoya. She had a pretty little face, and there was something between her, her father, and her brother that she couldn't stand seeing. That's why she'd made the girl her servant, to put her in her place. But things weren't going according to plan, because Yirim had clearly said he'd come back to get her. In other words, the prince had promised to return. There was only one way to fix the situation, and that was to get rid of the girl before he came back. Later, in the middle of the palace, the girl yanked the ornament out of Juksoya's hand, who shrieked, begging her to give it back, since she hadn't stolen it. While Lily questioned where she'd gotten it then, the girl felt very awkward, unable to reveal the truth about it. She also knew full well that nobody would believe her if she said the prince had given that to Juksoya. That's when a maid butted in, asking if that wasn't an ornament belonging to the late milady. Her revelation makes Lily spin around quickly, indignant, questioning whether that meant it had belonged to her mother. That's when the girl went ballistic, screaming as she demanded to know why the maid had that in her possession, which left Juksoya even more shaken. There was no way out of it. She'd have to beg for forgiveness, so the worst wouldn't happen. That little red-headed girl was more sharp-tongued than she'd anticipated, and asked if by chance our girl thought she could hide that forever. She'd stolen the true firstborn's place and spent years walking around the palace like she owned the place. Poor Lady Lily. That's when the truth came out and the girl exploded, condemning Juksoya for having stolen her life and fainting right after finishing her accusation. The other maids rushed to help her. After finding out the whole truth about the clan's fake daughter, little Lily felt ill and had to retire to her chambers. Juksoya stared at the room from behind the door, aware that she needed to apologize. She just didn't know that the little one had asked her brother to get rid of her, since she couldn't keep living under the same roof as our girl. That did set off an alarm in Juksoya. She already knew she wasn't wanted there, but now she was definitely in danger. Jukwayu lets out a deep sigh. He understood the new sister's situation, even though he knew it wouldn't be easy to fix at all. Even so, he said that if Juksoya was upsetting her that much, he'd make sure she'd never cross paths with the girl again. And that, indeed, worried our girl. Sometime later, she went to meet the young master, saying she knew he'd been looking for her, and the boy received her with a certain warmth, explaining he'd had a lot on his mind since what happened the day before. She knew he'd probably tell her to leave the Redbird clan immediately, just because Lily had asked for her to be gotten rid of. However, the girl was surprised when Chukwayu said that. Actually, he was full of regret and apologized for having treated her so coldly this whole time. Not understanding what was happening, the protagonist said it was fine, calling him young master. However, she was quickly corrected when he asked to be called brother, like usual. He mentions that day was the last day of the summer festival and invites the girl to go for a walk with him. But Juksoya argues she couldn't even dare think of such a thing. However, the boy said she'd already mentioned once that she was very curious about that festival, and just the fact that Chukwayu remembered that surprises our girl even more. She remembered the two of them dancing when the little girl was younger, and how he'd promised that once she made her first transformation, he'd take her to the festival. Pulling something out of his shirt, the boy adds that he wanted to return her animal spirit to the protagonist. Juksoya still looked at him with a certain weariness, but thanked him. He'd been the person most bothered by what happened on the day of her transformation, so giving her animal soul back meant he no longer cared about that. As the day went on, the lights came on, and the street was full of happy people at the festival. The boy offers a skewer with her favorite fruit to Soya, and since she took a moment to react, he was already about to take the offer back. But the girl grabbed the chance right away, thanking him nonstop. She watched him quietly because she really didn't understand what was going on. Even so, she decides to just go with the flow and tries a piece of the skewer, while Chukwayu asked a vendor for a bracelet with a red stone, explaining it was a gift for his sister. And the vendor breaks into a smile, assuming the little girl beside him was his sister, and saying she'd be very happy with the gift. That's when the young man asked to add another bracelet, handing it to the girl, who thanked him, calling him young master once again. Our girl had given herself over to the happiness of that moment, explaining she'd always wanted to go to the summer festival and was so happy the young man had remembered his promise. Her words leave a bitter taste in his mouth, and as the two of them walk, he calls out to the girl, explaining he needed to make a quick stop somewhere else and asked her to stay put. Suddenly, her head is invaded by an unmatched discomfort. She could see the young man asking what had happened to Soya, and she wondered if she was dreaming. It was like it was all an illusion. One of the Empire's knights answered that the girl was dead, which only left our girl even more confused. What did that mean? She was dead. What did that mean? But she was soon pulled back to reality when she was asked if she was listening. It was Chukwayu, repeating that he'd be right back, so she just had to wait. That's when she understood. That had all been a lie, and for some reason she'd realized it. That was the exact moment she was being abandoned, left to actually die. But that wasn't going to happen. So, all she answered was that everything was fine. Night fell over that place, and our girl thought about how her brother Chukwayu had no idea that the peaches he'd given her earlier were Lily's favorite fruit, and that she got a fever and her throat closed up every time she ate them. She sat on the ground feeling terribly unwell, trying to hold on just a bit longer, since she knew she'd be fine after a few hours. What really mattered was that she needed to decide what to do, because at this point she had nowhere to go, nothing in her name. That's when she heard a scream and an arrow flew right past her, telling her to run. A sharp blade drove straight into the ground and she saw hurried footsteps coming her way, her eyes widening in dread. That man in front of her was the same one from her vision. The same one who'd said she was dead. So it hadn't been an illusion. She'd somehow managed to see the future, and she didn't know how. But now she understood that Chukwayu's intentions had always been the worst. He wanted to kill her. She remembered how he'd promised Lily he'd get rid of the protagonist, using the phrase, "remove from your sight," just so he wouldn't have to make it clear he was going to take her life. As painful as that could be, the girl heard voices telling her she couldn't just stay there. She needed to figure something out and run. She didn't know whose voice that was that kept echoing in her head, but she didn't have time for that right now either. She needed to save herself, so she had to run. Huddled up, she did. She ran full speed, glancing back to see if she was being followed. However, on one of those glances, the little one ended up tripping over a rock and fell to the ground. The fall was hard enough to break the bracelet she'd just gotten, and her reaper managed to catch up to her, celebrating that he'd finally caught her, calling her Little Rat. He was already raising his blade, ready to deliver the final blow, when Juksoya closed her eyes, certain she was about to die. But something stopped him, a flash of light. She even considered it might be her father, but no, it wasn't him. That mark on her savior's clothing was very different. It was a tiger, and the white-haired man who saved her looked more serious than ever. The white tigers were the divine beings who guarded the West, and the one in front of her was Baek Sayon, the patriarch of that clan. As Prince Irim's teacher, he had traveled to the southeast, to Redbird territory, on the prince's orders. Before leaving, the young man had talked to the little boy, saying he didn't look well and should rest more, since everyone there would be worried if his fever came back. To which the boy answered that he was fine. However, there was something he needed to ask the young man. That's when he ordered him to go to the Redbird lands and steal the most precious thing he could find there. His request left the young man rather bewildered, having no idea what this precious thing the boy was talking about could be. However, Yirim promised that if he followed his orders, he'd hand over the dragon's blood grass that the boy had been searching for so long. That was a plant that bloomed from a very powerful dragon's blood, and it was the only medicine capable of purifying an animal spirit. Because of that, it was an offer too good for Baek Sayon to refuse. When he finally arrived at his destination, he wondered what could be the most precious thing in that territory. It was probably the treasured bow of the Red Birds, which had been passed down from generation to generation. Nothing could compare to it. At the same time, he wondered if his prince was really referring to a mere object, but despite his doubts, he headed south. And then, what happened? With one strike, he took down the person who was about to kill our girl. The tear he made in the young man's clothes revealed something even more curious to Baek Sayon, the mark of the Samjago, revealing that he was one of the elite warriors of the Red Bird clan. But why would he be attacking a child over nothing? Joksoya stared at her savior with tears in her eyes, in complete despair, and he stared back at her, a little hardened, even though he found the girl as cute as a cotton ball. For a moment, the protagonist thought that man with his back to her was her father, because he was the only one who ever seemed so tall and strong, but she knew she was being very foolish to think such a thing. Her father would never protect her like this, after everything that happened. Finally, Baek-sion crouches down and calls the girl Cotton Ball, asking if she was okay, and she snaps back, saying she wasn't a cotton ball. Trying to think of how to introduce herself, the girl decides to just give her name, explaining she was called Joksoya. That makes the young man laugh sincerely, because even that name seemed too cute to be real. Changing the subject a little, Baek-sion asks what exactly she'd done to be in such bad terms with such big fish. And noticing the girl looked confused, he explains that Beaten Man was part of the Redbird's bastard army. It finally hit her. Her hallucinations hadn't just been illusions, and the little one's tears start falling, leaving Baek-sion worried and confused. But she couldn't explain. Even if she wanted to badly, she could only cry non-stop. The poor guy panicked, since comforting a child had never been his strong suit. Even so, he got closer, gently stroking her hair, and commented it was way too late for a tiny little thing like the protagonist to be wandering around, so he'd take her back to her family. Trying to hold back her tears, the girl explains it was fine. But the young man insists, asking if she'd run away, because surely her family was worried sick. The problem is, that definitely wasn't the case, until, finally, the girl reveals she had no family, leaving the young man speechless. His prince's request echoed in his head, the most precious thing in the southern lands. Baek-sion still didn't know exactly what Yurim wanted, but he could tell that little girl in front of him had a very deep connection to the Redbird clan. But, if that was the case, he'd better steal the girl for himself, so he picked her up in his arms, surprising her. That made no sense at all, and the little girl questioned what he was doing, to which he answered that of everything he'd seen there in the south, she was definitely his new favorite thing. And, finally, he politely asked the cotton ball to let Baek-sion steal her. Juksoya thinks for a moment. She wasn't her father's daughter anymore, much less her brother's sister, and even so, she wanted to stay by their side. But remembering the visions she'd had, she was sure she didn't want to die. So, moved by hope, maybe if she stayed with that man, she'd manage to stay alive. And it was thinking about all of that she asked him to please take her with him. Baek-sion makes it clear that was a wonderful choice, and formally introduced himself, explaining he was the master of the East. And Juksoya just repeated her name, explaining she didn't have much of a last name or other references. The man decides to just call her Cotton Ball, making it clear that would be their color between the two of them, so she couldn't complain later. When the young man commented it might leak that he'd stolen something after sneaking into those Hicks land like a stray cat, and he could get in trouble, she burst out laughing, making it clear she'd never report him. But her chest tightened when the girl said probably no one would care that she'd gone missing. Actually, they'd probably be happy she was gone. That's when the young man noticed something strange about the girl. She was burning up with fever. It didn't take long before they returned to the White Tiger Palace, and the comments about the little girl kept coming, about how tiny she was, and how it looked like one puff of air would send her flying, and that's why they had to be careful. Our girl opens her eyes, wondering where she was, and sat up quickly, spotting her savior, who asked if everything was okay. She'd definitely passed out, and had to piece it together to realize it was Baek-sion who had brought her there after she'd fallen ill. The man orders the doctor to examine her right away, but the girl protests that it wasn't necessary, and explains it's just that she'd eaten a peach and would be fine after a while. That was curious. And the young man asks if peaches were really that dangerous, to which the doctor answers that, occasionally, they could cause more severe reactions in sensitive people, so he'd prepare a medicine to reduce the girl's swelling and fever. Curious, the man asks if the protagonist had eaten the fruit even knowing she'd get sick. He didn't even wait for her answer before ordering that every single peach in that territory be gotten rid of immediately, leaving Juksoya even more nervous. One of the children in the room asks who that girl was, to which he answers she was someone he'd stolen along the way, being accused by another one of his children of becoming a thief. Still not having much energy, our girl introduces herself as Juksoya. And Baek-sion smiles, reintroducing her by her nickname of Cotton Ball, making it clear that from then on she'd be living in that place. But that didn't bring the little one much happiness. Actually, now she worried about what would happen to her from then on, feeling her animal spirit pulse in her chest. The girl ended up dozing off again, and woke up to two strangers in front of her, leaving her even more confused about where she was. They ask how she was feeling, but Juksoya already sits up, yelling, asking who they were. With a friendly smile, the woman introduces herself as Hoyanjung, explaining she was part of the Red Fox family and would be her personal maid. As for the young man with her, his name was Nam San-ho, and he was from the Blue Wolf family. He'd be her new guard. The two of them make it clear they were very happy to be able to serve her. However, none of that made any sense. Why were they calling her young lady, as if she were part of the family? She knew that title was for someone special, like Lily. It didn't match her reality at all. Very friendly, the woman gets closer, explaining she was a guest of their master, so naturally, yes, she was a young lady. Except Juksoya tries to argue she wasn't a guest there. At the same time, she knew she couldn't let Baeksayan end up in danger because of her. Nobody could know she'd been taken from Redbird territory, and she remembered very well the conversation they'd had about it. Ignoring the girl's hesitation, Hoyeonjung explained that if they didn't treat her well enough, that would reflect terribly on their master, so she asked her to let them do their jobs. And, a bit reluctantly, the girl agreed, putting a smile on both of their faces. They could finally help her get ready, and just that suggestion already had Juksoya wondering what they were talking about. It didn't take long before she was all dressed up, having to listen to Hoyeonjung say she was as pale and cute as a rice cake. While combing Juksoya's hair, the woman asks if she'd ever heard of them. In the nation of amazing harmony, there were 4 families who could use the title of palace, besides the imperial palace itself, which leaves Juksoya rather curious. So, Hoyeonjung explains, there was the underwater palace of the west, which was the Dragon Palace, the mountain fortress of the east, which was the Baeko Mountain Palace, the celestial residence of the south, which was the Jujak Cheongung Palace, and the Palace of the Dead in the north, Hyuntao Dead. The name Jujak Cheongguk caught Juksoya's attention the most. Her father had already mentioned it before. He'd said the Red Bird family owned the longest palace in the south. Still combing the girl's hair, Hoyeonjung explains that the emperor had officially recognized the power of these 4 families, and the Baeko Palace, where they were, was one of them. So it seemed the tiger on Baeksaon's clothes really was a white tiger. A noise catches the girl's attention, and she notices a little boy peeking through the gap in the door. She remembered he'd been with her savior the day before, when she woke up. That's when Hoyeonjung mentioned that was the youngest son there, but didn't give it much thought, continuing her story about the White Tiger clan. She explains there were 3 young masters living there. The oldest was Baekaya. He was 15 years old and was out on the battlefield. Then came Baekayun, 11 years old, and that curious one behind the door was the 3rd, named Baekayul, 10 years old, letting slip that he probably should have been at sword training right at that moment. When their eyes met, it was like a beam of light had exploded in the room, making the boy hide quickly. Hoyeonjung laughs, commenting that it seemed like he wanted to be friends with the palace's new guest, which surprises our girl. Nervous, she comments that was impossible, leaving the woman worried because she didn't understand why she'd think such a thing. After all, she was adorable, something our girl also didn't believe. When she finally finished the hairstyle, she asked her to look in the mirror, explaining it was the style she knew best how to do, which surprised our girl. She was very cute and couldn't even deny it. However, something weighed on her mind. And after a moment of silence, she called out to the maid, explaining she wanted to thank Paeksan if that wasn't a problem. The memories were slowly coming back to her, and she remembered that, the day before, he'd asked the girl to stay there. After hearing those words, her fever spiked, and Baeksayan personally carried her to her room, while the girl apologized for being a bother. But, for him, that was no bother at all. In fact, he asked her not to worry, and to stay as long as she needed. That's when she realized that when he said to stay there from then on, he hadn't meant forever, and she was glad she'd realized that early, or she'd have ended up fooling herself into thinking she could live in that palace forever. Even so, she wished she could spend a bit more time there. It had been so long since she'd felt cared for, and a tear fell from her eye. Coming back to the present, one of the servants mentioned the little one's presence at the palace. His name was Jugyoung, and he introduced himself as Paeksayan's official attendant. He wanted to know what had brought the girl to his room. So the girl explains she wanted to thank her savior, something the young man makes clear he'd let his master know right away, asking her to wait. He announces the little one's arrival, explaining she wanted to show respect to their master, who seems thrilled that she was awake. His son, Baekahen, however, didn't look too happy. And the girl was surprised by his presence, recalling what Hoyeonjung had said about him being the 2nd young master of the White Tiger clan. But for some reason, he didn't seem to like her much, which left her quite nervous. Even so, she wanted to properly thank Paeksan, so she walked over, even while trembling. A bit downcast, she explained she was there to show her respect for having saved her and tended to her wounds, and also for providing a warm bed and clean clothes for her to wear. It's a surprise that Juksoya knew so much etiquette, but he was happy that things were pleasing her. When he asked how she was feeling, the girl explained she was much better. After all, her fever had gone down and her throat no longer hurt. Stroking her hair, he comments she looked much better now that she was healthy, and that show of affection makes her face flush. That's when he had a great idea. He called Baekhyun's attention so he'd show the guest around the palace, which surprises the little boy. Baeksayan asks if the protagonist had noticed his son the day before, formally introducing him by his full name. He didn't know how to explain that boy seemed to prefer doing anything rather than being with her. So she just kept her head down until the boy let out a sigh and agreed with his father. His expression turned from sour grapes to sweet wine when he asked if the girl's name was really Juksoya, asking if she'd like him to accompany her, something our girl accepts, even if a bit hesitantly. And so the two of them head off. Honestly, seeing those little creatures getting along like real siblings was downright adorable. When they were alone though, the atmosphere felt a bit different, and the little girl caught the young master's attention, who turned to her with some indifference. In his head, he wondered what on earth had gone through his father's mind when he proposed that, not to mention giving a child of unknown origin the room at the end of the hallway. Since there wasn't a single woman in the White Tiger family, that room was used to adopt a woman from somewhere else, so she could one day become the Yellow Dragon's bride, who was the Emperor's companion overseeing the entire continent. Looking at that girl, he wondered if maybe she was some cat hybrid, but she seemed too gentle for that. Maybe a rabbit. She seemed to live on grass and nothing else. Honestly, that archetype suited her well, but that wasn't very important right now. Actually, the only thing he questioned was whether his father was planning to bring her in instead of another child from a neighboring family. The gloomy atmosphere disappeared when the girl came across something magnificent. It was the palace's back garden, and the flowers were too beautiful. Even while keeping his friendly pose, the little boy felt physical pain at having to be that brat's companion. So he moved right along with the tour, saying they'd head to the library there. But the girl seemed uncomfortable and called out to him again. Worried, she asked if he wasn't too busy, to which he answered that he wasn't at first, but tried to fake it, even though, actually, he wasn't doing much. Friendly, she explained she could look around on her own, thanking him for showing her the garden despite being so busy, but he didn't need to worry and could go back to his work. Of course, Juksoyeon didn't insist, preferring anything to staying with her, so he said he'd call a servant to help her soon, and she could just stay in the garden and look at the flowers for now, something the girl thanks him for. Once alone, she could let out a sigh of relief. That boy didn't seem to like her presence much, and she'd almost bothered him for nothing. She remembered the servants of the Red Bird clan calling her a troublesome brat, but she was soon pulled from her thoughts by her earlier admirer, who was once again peeking at her from behind a door. She called out to him, giving him the title of youngest young master. The poor thing didn't know where to hide his face from so much embarrassment and got so nervous that he ended up tripping over everything. His cry of pain makes the girl ask if he was okay, but before she could get any closer, Baekgyeol asked her to stop and not come any closer at all. Even so, our girl insists that he was hurt. The little guy hadn't even noticed there was blood coming from his knee, and he tries to hold back his tears, maybe out of embarrassment at the whole situation. Quickly, the little one stands up, saying he was Baekgyeol, the third son of the White Tiger family, and that getting hurt over a mere scratch like that was something only cotton balls, like the girl, would do. So, he takes off running, leaving Soya totally confused. She wondered if he'd been that mad because he'd tripped over because of her, but honestly, she knew the boy needed a doctor to go after him soon, except she couldn't do much about it, because she was soon called by one of the servants. It was Nam San-ho saying he'd come after receiving a message from the second young master, along with Ho Yan-jung, who explained that he'd been way too much, leaving the little girl alone, no matter how busy he was. Except Soya quickly corrected her, saying that wasn't it. Actually, he'd been very kind and had shown her everything. The woman thought the little one was very sweet with everyone and asked if she wanted to go back to her room, which she accepts. On the way though, she kept her head down and Ho Yan-jung asked if something had happened. Our girl tried to find the words. But after telling the whole story about Baekgyeol, the servants burst out laughing, saying she didn't need to worry because that boy got hurt all the time, so it was normal there. Besides, he was a pretty tough tiger, even though he didn't look it. And their reasoning had to be enough for Soya, since there wasn't much more she could do. Meanwhile, the little guy was in his room, complaining about the pain as he got medicine put on his knee, but his servant argues he was being very dramatic that day. Even though Baekgyeol said it really hurt, Jukyoung just lectures him, saying that if he'd just stayed still, he'd have gone to fetch the young master himself. There was no need to go running around with an injured leg. However, the boy argues he couldn't show that kind of weakness in front of that cotton ball. Taking the chance, he asks what kind of animal the girl was, since he didn't think she was a tiger, to which Jukyoung answers maybe a rat, given her size. However, he didn't think that was the case. He'd heard rats were very noisy, maybe a puppy. They always had those bright eyes, and her hair was always messy because they couldn't fix themselves up. However, the servant countered, explaining those pups were usually naturally healthy, and the girl was very frail, which only added to the confusion in Baekgyeol's head. She wasn't like a porcupine, and her neck was too short to be a deer, so maybe she wasn't some wild beast from the west, since their master had picked her up from outside. It didn't take long for Baeksayeon's informant to explain that the youngest young master had spent the whole day following the clan's guest around, and that makes the young man laugh, commenting it seemed like Baekgyeol had taken a liking to her too. Jukyoung asks if he shouldn't tell his sons anything, since he wouldn't hear the end of it, but he didn't need to worry about that. Actually, to him, that was a good sign, a tiny little kid following an even smaller kid around. Breaking the mood a bit, Chukyoung comments about the little tiny one, wanting to know if she might not be some illegitimate daughter of Paeksan's or something like that. But just the idea leaves him completely rattled. However, it wasn't a strange idea. The man had gone to the palace to meet with the prince, and out of nowhere, came back with some random girl, on top of putting her in that specific room. Paeksan quickly cuts off the servant's train of thought, saying that was a ridiculous misunderstanding. Even so, Jo-kyung insists on knowing who that girl was. It's not like he'd just picked Soya up off the street. That's when Baeksayan realized everyone there thought he was joking when he said he'd stolen the protagonist on his way back, but he didn't really know how to explain it. He'd literally just come across Soya by chance and taken her with him. That's when he wondered, was it really just chance? The prince's words echoed in his head again. Steal the most precious thing from that palace. If she was truly worthy, he'd recognize her the very first time he saw her. Maybe that's exactly what had happened. Flashbacks of the boy's promise to hand him the dragon's blood grass come to his mind. That was a medicinal herb born from the blood of a very powerful dragon, a divine elixir that only bloomed when a new emperor took the throne. In other words, it was something a mere prince like Yirim couldn't just choose to give away like that. However, the boy made it clear he'd become emperor and promised Baeksa-an that before the year was over, he'd deliver the dragon's blood grass into his hands. For a moment, Baeksa-in wondered if that little young man's face had always looked like that, because the memory he had of him was very different. He remembered the boy smiling, asking him to take a look at what he'd written, but now his face was way too serious. In their conversation, the man had insisted on knowing exactly what he needed to bring back for him, to which the prince answered it should be something he'd recognize the value of, and they were talking about something very valuable, something he'd recognize at first sight. Of course it sounded very tempting to the young man, so he questioned what Yirim would do if, by chance, Baeksayan took the thing and just ran off with it. However, very seriously, the future emperor made it clear it wasn't something that could just be taken. All he wanted was for him to show that valuable treasure was safe. So, thinking about all of it, the young man couldn't help but wonder if this whole thing with the prince and his encounter with the Redbird's cotton ball were just coincidences, or if they were connected. Jugyoung brings him back to the present, warning his superior that since he'd given the girl the room at the end of the hallway, everyone thought the whole thing was very suspicious. So, he questioned if he was planning to register that little thing into the family, something Baeksayan quickly denies. However, the idea of having a daughter had already settled into his mind. He could imagine the protagonist calling him daddy, and it didn't seem so bad. And his face already made clear what he was thinking, to the servant, who hurried to say he couldn't just adopt any girl he found pretty and cute, since they were talking about an official representative of the family. All that yelling hurt Baeksayan's ears, and he argued there was no need to have just one young lady in the clan. Stressed, Chokyung says that wasn't necessary, explaining he should think it over better, because if he adopted two girls, there'd definitely be all sorts of comparisons between them, and questioned which of the two he thought would come out worse in that situation. Of course he understood Juksoya's situation was pitiful, but it'd be better to send her to a family that could adopt her and take proper care of her. He questions why Baeksayan had that cold look, who calls the servant a heartless red fox, asking if he even cared about the little cotton ball at all, and he answers that he did, but before he could continue his explanation, he's interrupted by Hoyeon-jung, who catches the patriarch's attention. He turns to her right away, asking what was wrong. Then, the woman reveals she had to tell him something about the little girl who was in the room at the end of the hallway. Her name was Juksoya, and she was having fun in the garden, being watched by Begayul, who wondered why she was so small and weak, having collapsed into his father's arms since day one, and if she was that weak, she wouldn't survive long. Suddenly, one of his servants catches his attention, warning that if his father found out he was skipping his training to watch the girl, that'd be a problem, but the boy didn't care. According to him, he was doing something very important. He needed to find out the cotton ball's true identity. Even though Jae-young thought it was very hard for him to find out anything just by watching from a distance, but Baekayul explained he couldn't look away. She looked so small and fragile, his heart raced. What would happen if he got close to her and the girl ended up getting so nervous she fainted? Honestly, he believed it'd only take one puff for the girl to collapse. And Jukyoung laughs at his comment because he believed the young master was more likely to pass out than she was. That's when, suddenly, the girl's body started tipping forward, which makes the little one let out a shout, confirming she'd finally collapsed. So, he rushes over, asking if she was okay. Baekayul searches non-stop for the girl near that huge rock, finding a big surprise. At his feet was Joksoya, transformed into the little bird she could turn into. So, that cute little bird was the cotton ball? Jukyoung agrees it really did seem to be her, and it was even cuter than expected. He was sure that, in the White Tiger Palace, that could only be the visitor who'd fallen asleep. Already in Baekayul's hands, the boy can't help but comment that she looked very tired, noting very obvious details. Worried, the servant asked if maybe Juksoya was sick and if they should call a doctor, but the young master explains it wasn't her body that was sick. There was something wrong with her animal spirit. It was like there were cracks in it. He runs in yelling for his Aunt Sarah, who gets up grumpily, asking who the troubled soul was who decided to burst into her chambers like that, already irritated to run into Baeksayeon's youngest son. But the boy didn't care about the scolding. He could only cry and beg her to save the little fur ball in his hand. The woman asks if that was the sick girl her brother had rescued, realizing this wasn't some scary beast, but a little bird. The boy explains she'd been breathing strangely and had suddenly fallen ill. So, even though a bit reluctant, Sarah says she could take a look and places her hand carefully over the girl, being enveloped in a golden aura. What she noticed was very different from what she'd expected, and the woman orders Jukyoung to call Baeksan immediately. Meanwhile, a few days earlier, at the Redbird Palace, Jukhwayu was receiving news that wasn't very pleasant. He questions what had happened to Juksoya, and the henchman answers that she was dead, even though that was a huge lie. But that wasn't all. They'd found some beads at the last place the girl had been seen, which surprises the little boy a bit, since it was the bracelet he'd given the girl that day. For some reason, he didn't seem satisfied with what had happened, and kept repeating the child was dead as if trying to accept it. The man explains they hadn't found the body, but there was no doubt Juksoya had passed away. The little boy squeezes the pouch of beads regretfully. He hadn't meant to kill her, he just needed to get her away from Lily, because if she stayed at the palace, Lily would keep being sad. However, since her body hadn't been found, he still had a spark of hope that his sister might be alive. But he pushed those thoughts away himself, since he was sure that, even if alive, she'd surely die soon. All because that child's animal spirit had already been destroyed. At the palace, Sarah was explaining that this spirit was very deteriorated and asked if her brother hadn't noticed that, to which he answers he could only confirm the presence of that soul in a person's animal form and had never seen the little girl transform. But that wasn't all. She reveals the child's animal spirit seemed to have been destroyed by someone on purpose, and that indeed manages to surprise Baeksan. The woman comments that actually the girl had been lucky to have stayed alive without her animal spirit for so long, and suggests that was probably why she had such a frail body, because there was no way anyone could develop properly without that soul. In that world, stripping anyone of their soul was a severe punishment given only to the most heinous criminals. And even in those cases, that authority was only granted to direct descendants of the four houses, which meant the head of the Redbird house, Juk Ayun, was the only one who could have done that to the girl. However, to Baeksan, that made no sense at all. Why would a man known for his sense of justice do something so cruel? The woman continued, saying it wasn't just that they'd stolen the girl's animal spirit. Actually, whoever had done what they did had completely shattered it. Being honest, the young man didn't know how anyone could be so cruel to that cutie. It made his blood boil just thinking about what Jukyoung had said earlier. He'd gone to report something about the little girl to his master. But then, the girl opened her eyes, desperate, and that ended up taking all of his focus. Baeksan rushes to her to find out if she was okay and if she felt any pain anywhere on her body, accompanied by the little boy, who was on the verge of bursting into tears, seeing the girl's state. She didn't quite remember what had happened. Her last memory was of feeling a bit dizzy with the sun beating down on that rock. Because of that, she jumped up and apologized for causing trouble again. She didn't know what to do, because Baeksan's expression seemed angry. She felt embarrassed, sure it was exactly what her old father used to say, that she was a terrible little bird. However, to her surprise, Baeksan said that wasn't it at all, and she didn't need to worry about those things, stroking the girl's hair. That unexpected affection makes her burst into tears completely, and the little boy is surprised too, shouting that his father had made the furball cry, blaming him as if the poor guy had actually done something wrong. Quickly, the protagonist defends Baeksan, explaining it was fine and she was just yawning, forcing a yawn to try to save the man's skin. He notices what was going on and lets out an amused sigh, and comments that their furball was still a bit sleepy, considering she yawned with her mouth open so wide it could split in half. The lady, however, watched them with a serious look, but she decided to break the silence and get the girl's attention, because they needed to have a little talk. Baeksan jumps in, saying the little girl still needed to rest, and the woman questions why he was looking at her like she was going to eat the child alive. She just needed to discuss a few things, like the White Tiger Palace's shepherdess, so he'd better get out of the way. However, she's caught off guard by a comment from Jukyoung, who asks if she really was going to eat the furball, accusing her of being a wicked witch for wanting to do something so horrible. After all, our protagonist was so tiny. And Baeksayeon backs him up, saying the girl really was too small to handle all that. Already stressed, she throws the two of them out, yelling that they were giving her a headache and had better leave. Baeksayeon leaves completely displeased, leaving his new guest in his sister's hands. She explains to her that her animal spirit was broken. It was a surprise to the shepherdess that she hadn't known this, because the element wasn't working at all. That's when it all clicked for her. It had been her brother, Jakwayu, who destroyed her animal spirit 3 years ago. But she had no idea that's what had happened. She didn't know he hated her that much, enough to destroy her animal spirit. A tear falls onto her hands, and before she knew it, she was sobbing, no matter how hard she tried to control herself. The shepherdess had no clue how to handle children, and it showed clearly, so she decided to change the subject a bit, realizing she hadn't formally introduced herself, and said her name was Sarah, the divine lady of the White Tiger Palace. And that cabin was under her care, explaining it was soundproof, which left our girl a bit confused, until she explained that meant the little girl could cry as loud as she wanted and nobody would hear a thing. But the mention of crying reminded her of what she'd been through with Lily, of how everyone had scorned her, saying she had no right to be sad at that moment, since she was the one who'd caused it all. It was strange, because at the Red Bird house, everyone got very stressed if she cried. A bit awkwardly, Sarah asks if maybe she was expecting a hug or something like that, which the protagonist immediately denies. But that denial doesn't help at all, and the shepherdess pulls her into a hug, somewhat reluctantly, patting her on the back. There was no way to resist. In her mind, Soya thought she shouldn't cry because she couldn't, but the tears wouldn't stop falling. That's when she completely gave in, and she still had to listen to Sarah's comment about how she looked like a wet cotton ball. Later, the servants came to apologize to her. Nam San-ho and Ho Yan-jung burst into tears, promising they'd never leave her side again, but the little girl said they didn't need to apologize for anything. Even so, they didn't care, saying that from then on, they'd hold her hand no matter where they went, holding out their hands to the little one, who didn't understand that gesture, since it was so much affection, but she quickly accepted it. And from that day on, the two of them really did go with MC everywhere she went. Besides that, one other person decided to start staying by her side more often. She turns to the young master and asks if he shouldn't be training right now, because the servants were already a little worried about him, but Jeokyoung explains he couldn't help it, because she was very weak, and asked who had given her permission to be that weak, which makes the protagonist apologize as always. The little boy explains that wasn't exactly what he was trying to say, and that he was only making an exception to protect her personally, since he was the third son of the legendary White Tiger House. Confused, the girl asked why he wanted to protect her specifically. And out of habit, he answered it was because she was very cute, but quickly corrected himself, saying he was afraid she might run into a ghost. Of course, that was just a lie to hide that he had a certain fondness for our girl. Staring intensely, Baekgayul stammers and explains he needed to protect her because maybe a ghost could get her, so he was worried. The mention of ghosts leaves Soya a little scared. So he continues explaining that there was a very scary ghost living in the White Tiger Palace who only took tiny little children just like her. Mentally, he blamed himself, since he'd almost let it slip that actually he was just keeping an eye on her because she was a very cute furball. But all he could do was hope no one had noticed how much he liked her, even though all the adults there were certain he was only doing that because he found the protagonist adorable. That had been the first time Baekgayul had ever met a baby bird. She fit perfectly in his hands and had these very cute little wings instead of paws. Maybe she couldn't even walk on legs that tiny. Even her feathers were very frail, and her skin was white and soft and fluffy. Of course, the girl was too sick to even open her eyes, but she was so cute, Baekgayul felt like he could die right there, bringing him back to reality a bit. The girl comments that if there really was a ghost around, that meant the young master would also be in danger, which catches him a little off guard. After all, that wasn't part of his plans. Noticing the worried tears on the girl's face, he makes it clear it was all fine. After all, he was the great third son of the clan, and he wasn't the least bit afraid of ghosts. When the girl tried to argue back, Baekgayul asked if she had any idea what a tiger really was, if she'd ever seen one in person, but the little one explains only in books. Continuing his speech, the boy explains that tigers were very strong and had sharp teeth and claws as hard as steel, all just to prove his strength to the girl. Realizing he had no choice, he offers to show Soya his powerful tiger form right that very moment, telling her to watch closely. Quickly, the boy is covered by a cloud of white smoke that fills the room, hiding his transformation, until his form is revealed. However, unlike his description, what appeared in front of Soya was a tiny, adorable white tiger cub, which makes her think that was the cutest thing she'd ever seen, melting at the sight of the little pink pads on his paws, and the little one offers to let her touch him. The attendants just watched the scene, finding it all very sweet, while the girl comments that his fur was really very soft. Realizing there wasn't much else to do there, Ho Yan-jung says goodbye, saying they were going to grab something to drink and they could have fun. And Soya doesn't even pay attention to them leaving, since she's still busy petting the little white tiger cub. Breaking the silence a bit, the little creature roars, saying it was now her turn to show her beast form. He wanted to see her cute little furball bird state again, but his words hit Soya hard, and her expression goes completely blank, remembering everything that was happening to her. The girl was about to cry right there when she started explaining it wasn't very nice, and she couldn't keep transforming, which leaves him a little confused. After all, he'd already seen her animal form and thought it was pretty cool. He didn't quite know what to do in that situation, since he was sure he'd end up making the girl cry if he pushed. With her heart aching, the girl remembered that boy, who could have been her friend, would end up disgusted if he saw her real form. After all, that's what had happened last time. She'd gotten pointed fingers at her face like she was nothing. To break the mood, a ball flies toward the little one, and the girl looks at it in shock, not knowing where it had come from. Then, Baekgyeol changes the subject, asking if the little fur ball wanted to play with him, getting very excited, insisting the two of them play together, his blue eyes shining with joy. Soya stares at the ball in her hands, still processing that unexpected invitation from the cub, but it doesn't take long before the two of them run off, laughing, happy, out into the courtyard together. However, from the window, Jukgaeun watches the two of them, wondering what on earth they were doing. And his servant asks what he was looking at, to which the little one answers he was talking about his brother, criticizing the boy for playing ball so pathetically when he should be at his training, and wondering when Baekgyeol would finally grow up for real. The servant didn't have much of an answer. He was a bit surprised the young master would say such cold things with such a peaceful look on his face, but besides that, he worried about Soya, because what would happen if she collapsed again just from running around like that? That was very stupid. He was sure she just couldn't say no to anyone, even if it hurt her own body, and she was pushing herself, which made him remember the whole thing with the peach she'd eaten, even though she was allergic. The servant asks if the little one wasn't worried about Soya then. But Jukgaeun explains it was nothing like that, because it made no sense to worry about someone who didn't even take care of her own body. Anyway, he changes the subject, saying the tigers from the secondary families were arriving for the next mountain festival competition. The festival was an event where young tigers competed for a prestigious title at the pavilion, but that year would be a bit different, because, depending on the festival's outcome, the girl who'd occupy the east wing of the palace would be decided, and everyone in the clan was paying very close attention to it. Jukgaeun questions who they should be keeping an eye on this year, to which the young man answers he'd been looking over the list prepared by Jukyoung lately. The first one noted was Lady Arang, from the brown tiger family. She was a lively girl who'd been noted as one of the representatives. Then, there was Lady Sahe, from the Black Tiger family, who, honestly, Jukgaeun thought would be lucky enough just to not embarrass her clan. And, finally, Lady Seo, from the Silver Tigers, whom Jukgaeun also didn't like. The servant starts to get nervous. If he didn't like any of them, maybe that was a sign he was being too picky. So, he tried to ask what kind of person he had in mind, if he was really going to have a sister. If he was honest, he'd prefer someone smaller, whiter, cuter, and the image of the protagonist comes to his mind. Back in the garden, Hoyeonjung offers a bit of water to the little one, asking if she was okay, and she quickly tips back the bottle, hearing the woman say the youngest master hadn't stopped running for even a second, even though he'd been dragged off to his training. She worries, saying that if she was only playing with him because she felt forced to, she didn't need to, but she's soon interrupted by Soya, who makes clear that no, she'd had a really fun time with the little one. However, she needed to know if there really were ghosts in that palace, because she'd gotten a little scared. The maid asks if she was scared of ghosts, but that wasn't quite it. Actually, what she was afraid of was something else. She worried that these ghosts in question would kidnap the young masters, since she hadn't known tigers could be so tiny and cute, something Hoyeonjung had to agree with. She cheers, saying the boys would be very happy to know she wanted to protect them in some way. That makes Soya's eyes light up with excitement. Sure, ghosts were a little scary to her, but that was okay, since she was sure not even a ghost would want to take her anywhere. She'd already heard that from the other servants back at her old palace. So, all she needed to do now was protect the ones she cared about deeply. Night had already fallen when Baeksahan noticed the full moon was approaching. Whenever the full moon rose in the sky, his chest weighed just as heavily as it had that other day. Terrible memories in his mind, of a blade driven into the ground, covered in blood. Baeksahan's mouth was also dripping blood, and the battlefield was more chaotic than ever, with flames consuming everything around him, while his animal spirit clenched in his chest. Baeksahan seemed more exhausted than ever. He truly felt dazed, and now he felt it even more, knowing a child as tiny as Soya was going through the same kind of pain he had, even though he'd discovered she could regain some of her strength with her brother's help. Unless her animal spirit fully healed, the root of the problem would remain. But there was only one way to make the girl heal: the dragon's blood grass. That also reminded him of the promise Yirim had made about delivering that plant, and he hadn't heard anything since. He'd said he'd check what had been stolen from the palace. For a moment, Baeksahan wondered if maybe that so-gentle prince was planning a bloodbath at the imperial palace or something like that. Apparently, he wouldn't get any good night's sleep that day. Maybe, if he was lucky, he could close his eyes for a moment. The full moon's light poured into his room like never before, troubling the young man's thoughts. Until a tiny little thing approached him, watching him sleep in silence. It was Soya, carrying a little pouch in her hands. A while earlier, while talking with Ho-yeon-jung, the maid had let slip that the boys would be very happy if she tried to protect them, which enchanted our girl, filling her with tremendous happiness. The people at the Redbird family used to say that about her. Once, she'd gone to return a handkerchief to one of the maids and ended up getting yelled at instead, being told she needed to give it back because now it was disgusting, while her friend backed her up, saying those ghosts should just take her away already for making Lily suffer. However, the woman was very harsh, saying that not even ghosts would take something as disgusting as Soya. They used to say the ghosts got scared seeing the things the girl had touched, and would even burn them right in front of her, but now things were different. If she put her things near them, that meant the ghosts wouldn't be able to do anything to Bae Sahin or the young masters. The problem is, she wasn't carrying anything with her at that moment. She'd been kidnapped after all. She'd even lost the little pouch she'd brought from the festival, and the bracelet Chuk Hwa-yu had given her had broken before she'd even arrived there, which left her a little sad, since it had been the only keepsake she had of her brother. Even so, she couldn't let the sadness get to her. That's why she decided to come up with a better plan, and she got some help from the wind, which caught her attention and gave her a great idea. She spent a good while cleaning some little pebbles she'd gathered in the garden, concluding they looked much nicer that way. She was sure that now that she'd touched them, ghosts wouldn't be able to get any of the masters. Now, all she had to do was somehow get them close to them. When she entered the first dark room, she felt a tremendous fear, and was interrupted in her plans by Ho-yeon-jung, who asked if something was going on, since it was already time for her to go to bed. A bit awkwardly, the girl tries to find the words to explain exactly what she was doing. And luckily, the maid went along with it, taking her along with the lantern so the two of them could see the way to Baek Sayan. The woman explains that the clan leader usually worked late, which is why he was in his office. However, she was absolutely certain he'd love those ghost-scaring lucky stones. But the two of them end up running into Jugyoung along the way, and he asks what was bringing the little one there so late at night, questioning if she needed to thank the leader again, which Soya denies, explaining that this time it was about something different. When she showed the pebbles to Jugyoung, even he got a little envious, seeing they'd been carefully made by the cotton ball's own hands. Honestly, he wished someone would make one of those for him too, since he was terrified of ghosts as well. And the little one immediately offered to make him one. She really was very kind. He kneels down, holding out his little finger so the two of them could seal that promise, and the little girl hooks her finger with his without a second thought, happy with all that affection, even if it was a bit strange. Ho-yeon-jung jumps in, saying it was outrageous for the young lady to make a stone like that for that old fox before making one for her, since she was her personal maid. Since the two of them were siblings, that kind of teasing was to be expected. Soya is surprised when Ho-yeon-jung asks, in so many words, for her to make an amulet for her too, and to make it before the one she'd make for Jugyoung. With that settled, the servant clears the way for the little one to deliver her amulet, and Ho-yeon-jung encourages her to go alone this time, even though it scares her a little. Those windows made the moonlight outside shine even brighter, and the little girl walks in with curiosity, taking in every detail of Baek Sayan's office for the first time. That's when she noticed that, even though he was right there, the young man was in a deep sleep. Apparently, he really had been exhausted, so the girl concluded it was better not to wake him at that moment. However, to her surprise, he let out a sound, which startled our girl, making her fall flat on the floor. Already with tears in her eyes, she begged for forgiveness, saying she didn't mean to wake him. That's when she noticed something else that left her even more desperate. She'd arrived too late. The ghosts had already taken Baek Sayan away, and now there was nothing she could do. Tearfully, she decides to appeal to the spirits and begs the ghosts to leave the young man in peace. Her hands glow a contagious pink, which startles the girl, not knowing what was happening. The room lights up with a pink glow and quickly returns to its normal shade, which leaves our girl wondering what had just happened, whether she'd imagined things or what. She looks again at Baek Sayan, who kept sleeping as if nothing had happened. So, the girl leaves the office and tells Jugyoung she thought the talisman had really worked, that the ghost bothering Baeksan had gotten scared and run off. Noticing how fast the girl was talking, you could tell she was very happy, and he comments that was a relief, while Soya smiles, promising she'd make one for him the next day. Ho-yeon-jung thanks her for the offer and makes it clear that was a task for the morning, since she needed to sleep and rest now. That's when she noticed a detail and questioned if Soya had perhaps fallen, since her hand was bleeding, which didn't seem to worry our girl much. She explained she'd fallen a bit earlier, so she must have gotten hurt and not noticed. Worried, the maid says it'd be better for them to head back to the room and put some medicine on it, which the protagonist agrees to, no problem. The next day, Baek Sayan woke up in his chair with a very strange feeling. He felt renewed, like he'd had one of the best nights of sleep of his life, right on the full moon no less, when his energy was usually much stronger. He was greeted by Juk-young, who complains that his boss had slept in the office again. That's when he noticed the little detail on his desk, and the young man explains that was a ghost-proof talisman the furball had left there. That leaves him rather intrigued. What did he mean, there was a ghost roaming the palace without his knowledge? But actually, what had happened was something else, and Juk-young explains it all, which makes Paek-san comment that his son was a terrible liar. However, it was very funny to think the cotton ball had brought that stone just to protect him. Since he hadn't had any nightmares, maybe it really had worked. It was funny to think the little one had tried to protect him with that tiny little body of hers. A truly precious meeting between the two of them. Excited, the servant suggests that, since he'd received such a great gift, he could give something back to the girl, which makes Paek-san remember a sword he'd received as a gift from His Majesty last winter. He didn't need it, so he could give it to her. However, Juk-young pushes back, explaining that only the young masters of the White Tiger clan would like a gift like that. Really, he had no idea what it was like to have a little girl. So, the servant explains that girls Soya's age preferred things that were cuter and more charming. And he was even called prejudiced by his boss, who explained it was very narrow-minded of him to think girls didn't like swords. The problem is, that was a real sword, way too big for something so cute and tiny. It was heavy and very sharp. Soya might even hurt herself just playing with it. Paek-san's ears were already aching from all the complaining, and that last part, about the girl getting hurt, is what really catches Paek-san's attention, who makes it clear that could never happen. But trying to find a solution for the gift, he asks if the servant had no suggestions. Meanwhile, Hoyeon-jung was preparing the child's medicine, who looked rather anxious about that tea she was about to drink. She drinks it all without a single ouch, which surprises the maid, since that was a very bitter herb, and even so, the girl hadn't complained. She knew that if it were one of the young masters, they'd be running from any medicine at all. She really was a very well-behaved little girl, so she couldn't hold back her words, praising her for doing so well, which makes her cough a little. Now that the bad part was over, they could move on to the treats, and she put a little candy in the girl's mouth, who was happy it was something very sweet, just the way she liked it. At that moment, she remembered Baeksan's words about how she could stay as long as she needed. Honestly, she wished from the bottom of her heart that time would still last a lot longer, at least long enough for her to remember that sweet taste forever. Suddenly, someone enters her room looking for the little one. She recognized that voice. It was Juk-young, with a box in hand, explaining their master had sent her a small gift in exchange for the talisman. The little one starts opening the wooden box with great curiosity, and her eyes light up, seeing it was a stuffed tiger, making the young man joke that thanks to the talisman, this tiger had managed to have a good night's sleep last night. Hoyeon-jung encourages the girl to take the toy, hug it, squeeze it, since it was now hers, a gift from the clan leader. And so the girl does, squeezing the little creature with an inexplicable tenderness. It was so soft and fluffy, almost like Baekgayul on the day she saw him transform. Hesitant, she asks for paper and a bit of ink. When Hoyeon-jung asks if she needed to draw something, the little one shakes her head. She actually needed to write a letter to Baeksan, which makes both adults' eyes go wide. Meanwhile, at the Red Bird Palace, Lily shows her father a flower, saying it was the same color as her hair, which makes Juk-ayan chuckle and agree. He'd been afraid his daughter's feelings had been hurt after what happened with Soya, but was very happy and relieved that she'd recovered quickly. Juk-wyu approaches the two of them and reveals to his father that he needed to talk to him about something. Once alone, the little one states that child was dead. He explained he'd only wanted to send the old sister away so she'd stop bothering them, but when the three-legged crow got there, she'd already been taken, leaving only a trace of blood behind. And he hands a small pouch to Juk-ayan, explaining that was all that was left of her. He remembered he'd given that to the girl earlier. He remembered how excited she'd been, asking if their father thought she'd make a good transformation, since she worried about not being able to turn into a firebird like him and his siblings. At the time, all the young man had said was that she didn't need to worry. He'd tucked one of his feathers into that little pouch for her to carry as a lucky charm, so everything would be fine, and it didn't matter if she ended up failing, because she'd always be his daughter. However, despite his worry, the girl had managed to transform perfectly into a bird as white as snow. Now, Juk-ayan wondered if maybe, if the girl had just failed to transform, things would be different, and tears well up in his eyes. Inside the pouch, the feather he'd given the girl was still there. He was a bit surprised she'd kept it this whole time. Then, the patriarch slams the table, saying it'd be good for the boy to find that child immediately. He didn't even let him argue back or say anything, just said that since nobody had been found, there was still hope. Even so, Juk-wyu explains that even if the girl had survived, she wouldn't last much longer because her animal spirit had already been brutally damaged, which makes Juk-ayan's eyes go wide. Even so, the man insists he wanted to see the body. He'd only believe Soya was dead once that happened. Otherwise, the doubt would haunt him forever. Sometime later, Baekgyeol was showing the talisman he'd gotten from the little girl, very happy, to his brother, who didn't seem to care much, and just asked if that stone was supposed to be some kind of amulet. Content. The boy explained that he'd told the girl the day before that there were ghosts in the White Tiger Palace, so she'd given him that gift to ward them off. That seemed like such nonsense to Jung-ayeon. However, it was only then that it occurred to him that what she'd left in his room the previous night had been a talisman. Flashbacks of the girl slowly entering his room come to his mind. She tried not to make a sound, leaving the little stone on a table beside the young man's bed, who just pretended he'd fallen asleep. As soon as he heard the door close, his eyes went wide. He needed to know what that girl thought she was doing in someone's room in the middle of the night. That's when he saw the little stone, but didn't understand what it was for, so he threw it in the trash, thinking it was just some lame prank. Curious, he questions whether Baekgyeol had by chance seen the little one transform, which the boy confirms, explaining she was very tiny and very cute. However, he didn't understand why Soya was so afraid of her transformation. She looked so adorable. That's when the thought occurred to him that maybe, since she was so cute, she was afraid of being kidnapped. And he questioned what they should do about it, panicked that this might actually become a reality. He complains about bumping into his brother because he'd suddenly stopped walking, and someone calls out for Baekgyeol, startling him. It was his trainer, which leaves him even more startled, since he hadn't realized they'd been heading toward the palace's training grounds. Seriously, the man explains that yesterday the little one had managed to escape him, but now that wouldn't be possible. He even tried, but was grabbed by his clothes by Jung-ayeon, who needed the boy to dedicate himself more to this kind of task, except that leaves little Baekgyeol even more outraged as he's dragged off by his trainer, saying he had no brother anymore after that betrayal. Finally, Jung-ayeon would get a little peace for himself. That castle had been chaos ever since the girl arrived, and speaking of her, Soya was in the garden looking for a pretty little stone. She'd been asked by Nam Sanho if maybe she was going to make those enchanted stones for everyone in the palace, and he suggested they play a game to see who could find the prettiest stones, and the winner could keep all the stones they found. She was excited because, if she really won, she could make 3 amulets. Someone approaches the little one, who is really very focused on her search, so much so that she got startled running into Jung-ayeon, who was as serious as always. The girl bows to him formally, wishing him good morning. Her face lights up for a moment when he comments he'd noticed she liked playing in the garden, and his presence makes her wonder if he too had felt the effects of her talisman, just like Paek-san. Little did she know it had already been thrown away. She was already starting to explain about the night before when she's interrupted by the boy, who said she'd left trash in his room, warning that pranks like that could get her into serious trouble. That leaves her a bit upset. After all, it wasn't trash. It was a lucky charm, but she understood a noble might see it differently. He continues, asking, please, that she not enter his room without his permission from now on, since she wasn't even an official member of the White Tiger Palace. The little one hangs her head, sincerely apologizing for what she'd done. She didn't know why, but that reaction ended up leaving Jung-ayeon feeling very frustrated and guilty, even though he knew it was natural to set boundaries, especially with an outsider, which was Soya's case. Without giving the conversation any more rope, he says goodbye and wishes her fun playing. However, the girl can't get it out of her head. Had he acted like that because the talisman was just a plain stone? That's when a great idea came to her. She could make a better amulet, especially for him. The problem is, she didn't have much to work with. Actually, all she had was the gift she'd gotten from Baek-seon, and giving it to Jung-ayeon would be totally disrespectful to the patriarch. However, something catches her attention, some suspicious movements around there. The servants were loading the carriage with someone who might be a palace guest. Later, when she was with her servants and Baekgyeol, the little girl received the title of winner of the game they'd been playing earlier. She'd managed to get the boy involved in the game once he was let out of training, and he seemed entertained when Ho-yeon-jung explained the prize was 3 pretty stones. Staring at the objects, the girl felt a bit hesitant to accept, because her friend's stone seemed nicer. However, she's interrupted by Baekgyeol, who jumps out of his chair, saying he'd already said the stone the protagonist found was cuter, and the compliments make her blush. She could feel her heart extremely satisfied with all of it, which was a new sensation. She calls Ho-yeon-jung and points to a pot in front of her, asking what that was. Then, the woman explains they used it for ceramic art, suggesting they could use it to paint the stones somehow, and that seemed to be a genius idea, because Soya's eyes light up right away. She knew they'd look much prettier this way, and would look like special amulets, so the second young master would surely like it, and she'd be forgiven. Taking advantage of them being there, she brings up having seen a young girl getting out of a carriage earlier, and they explain those must be the tigers from the other associated families arriving, since the mountain festival was about to start, something the girl had no idea about. So Ho-yeon-jung explains it was an event where the young tigers of the East gathered to compete for the title of Lord of the Mountain that year. It was curious to think there would only be tigers there, and Baekgyeol confirms there was no other species involved, even though none of them had fur as cool and white as his. The maid approaches, commenting on the fact that the little girl was only painting tigers, and she explains those new stones would be for the family's guests, since they were people dear to Baeksayeon, and she was determined to protect everyone. Speaking of him, his correspondent had just found him to say he'd finished investigating the southern lands, as he'd been ordered. But nobody seemed to know Soya. That was very strange. Even for the Suzaku clan, it'd be impossible to hide a child that way. So they only had two options left. Either the little girl was lying through her teeth, or she was a child of the clan who'd never left Suzaku territory. The possibility that she was the daughter of an important clan haunts Baeksayeon a little. That's when he remembered Jukgayeon did indeed have a daughter. Jukyoung asks if Baeksayeon was really suggesting the tiny cotton ball was the Redbird family's daughter, but that didn't seem so absurd. After all, they were the same age. Which wasn't a lie, but the thing is, that girl had just turned 9 and finished her first growth phase. She'd already been added to the family's official records, and her name was Lily. Besides, he was almost certain there was no reason for the Redbird's daughter to be hunted by the three-legged crow. If she really was on their estate, maybe she was just one of that young lady's servants. Even so, Baeksayeon insists that wasn't so impossible, because the only thing they knew for sure about her was that she'd been within Redbird territory. But something occurred to him, and he called Jukyoung seriously, which makes the servant curious because of his tone. He wanted to talk about how he found the little girl's handwriting very cute. He'd received the letter that said, "Dear Baeksayeon, thank you for the doll. It's very pretty and warm when I hug it. It makes me sleepy, and I think it's because it's a gift from you. The talisman I gave you was just my kind of selfish way of wishing you protection, but he accepted it and even gave me a toy in return. I spent the whole day smiling, so thank you very much, Baeksayeon. I will pray for your happiness every day. Sincerely, Soya." He knew what his master wanted with all that, so he made it clear his answer was still no. No matter how polite the little girl was, she was still a bird, not a tiger. More important than that, he wanted to know if Baeksayeon had had time to look at the report on the other little girls from their associated families. They'd been carefully selected, so it'd be good to take a look before the mountain festival. He didn't even need his answer to realize the young man hadn't even opened the scroll. It was covered in dust, and he also knew it was because he'd spent all his time distracted by the cotton ball. Seriously, Jukyoung makes it clear that, before the festival ended, he needed to figure out and decide what he was going to do about Soya. One of the maids interrupts them, explaining the protagonist was there to see him, which lights up Baeksayeon's eyes instantly. She was as cute as ever, holding a basket in her hands, a bit anxious. He couldn't help but notice that object. Her presence seemed to affect even the servant, who couldn't stop smiling. Then, the little one takes one of the stones out of the basket and hands it to him, explaining it was the talisman she'd promised him a few days ago. And she'd drawn it herself. She seemed very happy, not quite sure if she should really accept something so precious. Watching the scene, Baeksayeon grits his teeth. That fox was really detestable, and he warns the cotton ball that she didn't need to be so nice to that mean fox. But the little one doesn't even pay attention to that comment because she had something else to give Baeksayeon, another amulet, painted for him, and that makes the young man blush at how cute it was. He still tries to hide how happy he was about it, explaining she didn't need to make him another one. However, there was a detail he didn't understand, and he questioned why there was a cat drawn on his, which leaves her a bit embarrassed, since to her that wasn't a cat, it was a tiger. Her voice trembles as she asks if he didn't like it, and, worried about the little one's feelings, Jukyoung jumps in laughing, asking how that could be a cat, since it was clearly a tiger, commenting that Baeksayeon's eyesight must be getting worse with age, something he agrees with. He didn't want to hurt his precious little girl, and made it clear that now that he was looking closer, he could definitely see a tiger. Worried, the girl asks if it wasn't a big deal that his eyesight was getting worse, which it was, so it'd be good for her to visit him as much as possible. She didn't know it really helped just being there, but Jukyoung jumps in, making it more than clear that it helped a lot, that the office lit up just with her presence. However, the girl counters, saying she hadn't even awakened her abilities yet, so there was no way she could have that kind of power. The young man answers he'd heard that some prodigy children could use their powers through their natural aura, even before awakening their true animal spirit, and maybe that was Soya's case, who looked at him with sparkling eyes. As the day went on, the girl kept handing out a lucky stone to everyone who crossed her path. Now, she just hoped Shek-Gahyun would like the one she'd made for him. However, her walk was interrupted by someone pointing at her, saying she was very small. It was a Rang, who asked who Soya was, since she'd never seen her before. In fact, looking at her, she didn't think she was a tiger. It didn't take long for the little girl to make the connection, and understand this was one of the mountain festival candidates. So, she greeted her formally, introducing herself, explaining it was Baeksayeon who'd brought her to that place, which surprises the little one a bit, who finally understood that this was the cotton ball staying in the room at the end of the east hallway, and that surprises our girl a little. Except Orang explains there was no way she wouldn't know that, since everyone knew that room was reserved for the White Tiger family's lady. Everyone, except the protagonist, the girl continues, saying her father had told her the best tigress in this festival would get the room she was currently in and become the young lady of the white tiger family. Of course, Soya had already wondered why there was a girl's room in that place when it was only surrounded by boys, so Baeksayan was just letting her use a very precious room for a while. When Arang commented she hadn't known there was already an owner of the room, our girl nervously fired back that she wasn't the owner of anything. And what seemed like a friendly conversation started turning into a distasteful joke when Arang asked if maybe she thought she'd be able to take that spot as Baeksayan's daughter, since it didn't even look like she had an animal spirit. Then, she questions if maybe she wanted to become a fake tiger, and that hits her hard. That word fake makes her remember her time at the Redbird Palace, when people lamented the hard life Lily had had, blaming the girl and calling her a liar. That hits her so hard she drops her basket and makes it clear she'd never take Baeksayan's daughter's place. Her reaction ends up worrying Arang, who asks if she was sick, but the two of them end up being caught by another little girl. It was Seo, who'd recognized young Arang, saying she was looking forward to competing with her for the room at the end of the hallway. But now, seeing her provoke such a small child, who wasn't even a real tiger, she was very disappointed. Nervous, the girl explains she hadn't tried to do anything. She wasn't trying to provoke her, but she couldn't even explain herself because our girl interrupted her and explained nothing bad was happening to her. She just wasn't feeling very well to begin with. Which surprises the girl a bit, but she comments that, indeed, her face was quite pale. The girl runs off, saying Soya should never get sick in front of her again, since she'd worried far too much about it. While Seo asked if everything was really okay, the little girl made it clear she didn't need to worry about her. And finally, Seo introduces herself by name and makes it clear that, if she needed help, she could count on the girl. Her attitude makes her smile for a moment. It was nice to think someone so kind was competing for a spot in the White Tiger family. Finally, the little one thanks her, making it clear she'd take her new friend's advice. Sometime later, sitting alone in the hallway, the girl kept thinking, wondering exactly how long Baeksayan meant when he said, "You can stay as long as you need." The room's true owner would arrive soon, so the time was coming for her to leave the White Tiger Palace, which makes Soya's heart clench with a sadness she couldn't quite explain. Meanwhile, Jukgayan watched the little stone he'd gotten from Soya through the window. He found it odd that the girl hadn't passed through the courtyard, because she usually took a walk during the hour of the sheep, but he hadn't seen her all day. In fact, he'd only gotten the stone back because he'd spent a good while digging through his own trash and left it on the windowsill so she'd notice. Of course, it seemed like he cared too much, but he had a lot of other things on his mind at that moment. His thoughts were interrupted when someone called out to him. It was his servant, saying the Enho clan had invited him for afternoon tea, and the boy accepts, saying it'd be great to meet with the Black and Red Tiger clans before the festival. He asks what that was he was holding, to which he answers he'd gotten an amulet from the protagonist, and she'd even painted his stone. That bothers him a bit, because it makes the little one wonder if she really liked the young man that way. Noticing his face, the servant asks if he hadn't gotten anything. More confidently, Jukgayan explains he'd gotten his before all of them, except the boy makes clear he was talking about something different, explaining that the girl had spent the previous day busy painting a bunch of stones and giving them out to everyone in the White Tiger Palace, and even to the guests from the associated families, which catches the young master off guard, making him grit his teeth, heading straight for the exit of his room. Nervous, the young man explains the girl must have forgotten about Jukgayan, and that's why she hadn't given him one either. He was already cursing to the four winds that he didn't need some random stone anyway when he ran smack into Soya, which left him extremely flustered. Since she'd heard the end of his sentence, the girl turns her back and apologizes, stammering. Jukgayan even tried to call her back because, in the end, he hadn't meant to say those cruel things, but it was too late. The protagonist was already far away, and honestly, she felt relieved because if she hadn't overheard that conversation, she probably would have just upset the young master even more. Apparently, he really didn't like stones, but she still wanted to make an amulet just for him before leaving the White Tiger Palace. The girl was pulled from her thoughts when she heard an argument between two people, and one of them was telling the other she was a stupid brown tiger and would never be recognized as a real tiger, and Orang answers she didn't want to be part of the same family as the other girl. She'd only gone there because she was curious about the poor tiger who'd have to join that family of idiots, which stresses the little one out even more. Baekgayol complains about Soya's interruption, asking who dared interrupt such an important moment, but his weapons fall to the ground when he realizes who it is, turning from sour grapes to sweet wine, turning into a very cute tiger and jumping into her lap to ask what she was doing there, which leaves Orang even more stressed because he couldn't just abandon their argument like that. Soya gets startled by their approach, and Orang quickly bites Baekgayol's tail. They end up knocking the little girl to the ground, and the other girl gets a lecture from the young master, who says she'd almost hurt the cotton ball because of that carelessness. And that does seem to worry Orang a bit, but Soya quickly gets up, explaining she wasn't hurt at all, and there was no need to worry so much. Soya comforts Arang, who couldn't stop crying, even while denying she was worried. She was already about to pet her when the tigress scolded her, running away, saying she'd been the first person who'd hugged her that tightly in her life, and that she'd get her back. And that unexpected escape makes Baekgyeol burst out laughing, and Soya too, who also seemed to be having a lot of fun. Then, the protagonist comments she'd had that impression since she'd met her, but Lady Arang was very similar to Baekgyeol, who feels offended at being compared to that stupid tiger. That's when she remembered why she'd come to see him. She wanted to know what her brother Jogayan liked, and that was indeed a question maybe even the little boy himself couldn't answer. Besides, why should she care what he liked or didn't like after having sent him off with that trainer like he was a bag of trash? Worried, the little one asks if he was trying to hide something from her or something like that, just because she'd made that comment about him being similar to Lady Arang. But he looked so cute pouting, so cute she almost lost the will to cheer him up. So, she keeps insisting, asking what Jogayan liked. She just didn't know the conversation was being overheard by a third person, but the tiger used his instincts to find out, running and lunging at the little girl and asking why she was spying on them like that. He was ready to attack when he was stopped by the protagonist, who held him back, and Baekgyeol quickly protests, telling her to let go of him. The girl scolds him, saying he didn't need to do that kind of thing because he was scaring Seo, even though that was the normal way tigers played. So he apologizes for scaring the girl, who answers she knew he hadn't meant to hurt her, but he should apologize to Seo, not her, and so he does. Still not quite understanding what had happened, the silver tigress answers it was fine, that she was okay. However, she'd heard their conversation, and it seemed she was really interested in knowing what Jogayan liked, something Soya confirms, explaining she wanted to make a second talisman for that young master, but he didn't seem to like stones at all. Baekgyeol is indignant that his brother was going to get another gift, since he didn't deserve anything that came from the protagonist, and advises she start ignoring him. But the girl continues her train of thought, saying that if she wanted something that would charm Jogayan somehow, she could think of a sky flower. It was a very rare flower that only grew on Mount Horim. He loved flower bouquets, so she was sure he'd like it. That lights up Soya's eyes, who had no idea that such a serious young man could actually like delicate things like flowers, but she thanked Seo enormously for the help. Baekgyeol asks if she was really going to climb Mount Horim just for that, and she explains she'd ask Hoyeon-jung and Nam San-ho. It'd be her first time climbing a mountain, but she was sure they'd let her go. And, of course, her new friend offered to go along. According to him, he knew the way to the mountain like the back of his hand, so they'd better hurry to ask for permission. But, before leaving, Seo called out to the girl and handed her a little sachet, explaining it was a gift in exchange for the talisman she'd gotten from her earlier. The little one was enchanted, since it was something very pretty and precious, and thanked her enormously. Noticing she hadn't moved, Baekgyeol hurries her along, and finally she says goodbye, saying she was looking forward to their next meeting. However, as Soya walks away, Seo's face darkens for some reason. The next day, Jogayan was sleeping, hugging his teddy bear, while Baekgyeol snored away in a heavy sleep, until the middle boy got up looking for his father, who smiled, commenting he'd woken up quite early that morning. So, he explained he'd done that because he knew the young man wouldn't be back until very late, but he made it clear he wouldn't take too long, asking him to keep an eye on the White Tiger Palace while he was away. While he and Baekgyeol were away, he'd be the master of that palace. And the little one asks him not to worry, since he'd keep everything organized and safe. Continuing his walk, Jukyoung commented that Jogayan always seemed much happier around his father, but Baeksayan strongly disagreed. Actually, lately the boy seemed much more interested in the little cotton ball than in him, which is a bit contradictory to the servant, who thought it was young Baekgyeol who was obsessed with the little girl. Smiling knowingly, the man explains there were things only parents could see. His second son acted gentle, but he was more sensitive than the others. He could sense him watching Soya, trying to be careful while also being extremely drawn to her. And knowing Soya as he did, he thought maybe she could disarm his son a bit, a thought that actually made him quite happy. Speaking of the girl, she was looking at herself in the mirror, commenting on how Hoyeon-jung had done such a pretty hairstyle for her. Besides that, she'd prepared a very complete snack for the girl to take, and asked her to eat if she got hungry. All that care left our girl feeling emotional, and the cute face she made when she was emotional made Hoyeon-jung emotional too. The maid squeezes her, saying she was very cute and was truly very worried, so she didn't know what to do, since she was very sorry she couldn't go up the mountain with her. Because of the inspections in the eastern lands before the mountain festival, Nam San-ho, who represented the Blue Wolf clan, was accompanying Baeksayan on a mission, and the girl needed to stand guard at the White Tiger Palace in his place. Because of that, the two of them would be too busy to accompany her on the climb. Still worried, the woman comments that maybe it'd be good to reschedule this little adventure. And the young man laughs, saying she was just very worried and trying to protect the little one. There wasn't much to do about it. However, if it eased his co-worker's mind, he could lend his magic gem to the little girl, explaining it was a treasure of his clan called the Orb of Wind. Supposedly, it would protect the protagonist and strengthen her legs and elbows, but the girl gets a little nervous since she wasn't sure he should really be lending something so valuable to her. Except for Nam San-ho, that wasn't a question at all. He asked her to consider it a thank you for the stone talisman she'd given him herself. Again, Ho Yeon-jung reinforces that she had to be very careful, and the girl says she didn't need to worry and would be back before sunset. Suddenly, her adventure partner, Ba Ga-yul, enters the room, accompanied by a boy, saying good morning and asking if everything was ready. The boy introduces himself as Su-rai, saying he'd be going with the two of them, and our girl greets them formally. Nam San-ho asks Su-rai to look after the young lady, and even if she got just a bit tired, he should carry her on his back right away, which wasn't a problem for him. Finally, the three of them could set off on their big adventure. While they were still in the forest, the servant made a point of checking that Soya's legs were okay. Being very honest, thanks to the magic stone Nam San-ho had given her, she felt no pain at all, which was a relief. Meanwhile, Baek Ga-yul was happier than ever, humming a tune non-stop while in his tiger form. It had been a while since she'd seen him this excited. He calls out to Soya, asking her to hurry because there were flowers everywhere around there, and the sight left our girl quite stunned. They were surrounded by colorful, fragrant flowers. That's when she pointed to one specific flower. It glowed differently from the others, and she was sure that was the paradise flower they were looking for. Baek Ga-yul uses his tiger sense of smell to inspect it, and they ask what he thought, until the boy swallows the flower, which leaves the other two shocked. However, at least he could confirm the taste was indeed a paradise flowers. There definitely had to be others around, and the protagonist got excited about that possibility. Promptly, the girl picked the flower up off the ground, and they comment on how the roots weren't damaged at all thanks to the care the girl had taken pulling it up, unlike the young master, who'd swallowed the very first flower they saw. However, not everything there was safe, and someone was watching them from behind a tree. Actually, someone was watching Soya from behind a tree. The girl senses a strange presence and asks who was there. She could definitely feel someone watching her, even though she couldn't spot anything. Maybe she was just imagining things, but that soon passed when Baek Ga-yul called her, placing a flower crown on her head as he asked if it didn't suit her looks very well, and the girl says that was a punishment for having managed to escape him when they were playing. The little creature complains, indignant, that he hadn't known the penalty would be that. After eating, they go back to playing tag, and the little girl gets stuck being it. However, something catches her attention. Suri was acting like he was in a lot of pain, so she asked if something was wrong, to which he answers his stomach was feeling very strange. So, she suggests they head back, but the boy tries to pull himself together, saying he wasn't going to let his first outing end that way. He'd just make a quick trip back to the White Tiger Palace, but she could stay there with Baek Ga-yul, something she agrees to without arguing. He transforms into a blue wolf to get there even faster. It was kind of shocking how fast he was, even without using his gem. Since she was playing hide and seek with the young master, now is the perfect time to find him. However, something catches her attention. There were vicious critters coming after her. They looked like scary foxes, and she didn't understand why they were there, because she remembered Ho Yeon-jung mentioning that the beasts living in those mountains didn't attack people. But those in front of her would definitely tear her to shreds if she kept standing there. She knew she had to find a way to reach the young master, because she remembered Suri's words well before he left, but she also couldn't just go, because if she did, those beasts might end up hurting her. However, Soya tried to find some courage, since she was wearing the wind gem Nam San-ho had given her, so she should be able to escape easily. So, the girl took off running, being chased by those terrifying animals. She broke out in a cold sweat, but didn't stop for a single second, while those hungry things chased after the protagonist. However, seeing a rock in front of her, she had a great idea. They wouldn't be able to follow her up there. If she used the power of that amulet she'd received, maybe she really could save herself. So the girl does, climbing onto the rock with great effort, and, as expected, they couldn't simply follow her. However, she noticed something strange. Those two beasts, who'd seemed so brave seconds ago, were now trembling on the ground, looking scared, out of nowhere. That's when she noticed that actually it was the ground that was shaking, a tremor so intense it knocked her off the rock. That wasn't just an ordinary rock. Actually, it was a massive magical beast. The shock was so great, the girl's body could barely move. Even though she knew she needed to run, she couldn't. She felt hypnotized by that creature. Suddenly, that huge, terrifying thing turned into a small black bird, which surprises her a bit. It wasn't just any bird either. It was like it was her, but the little creature's body quickly started to unravel. Was it changing shape again? Ears soon appeared, revealing the image of a tiger, also black. That was truly frightening, and he approaches the girl, sniffing at her, looking at her like some kind of fool. His eyes light up, seeing something about the girl, which she didn't understand what excited him so much, until he threw himself on the ground, being even more adorable. Nervous, and still a bit wary, she asks if he wasn't going to do anything bad to her, and the little bear-like thing shakes his head no. She apologizes, saying she'd misunderstood and thought he was going to attack her, but he shakes his head again. until something catches the little one's attention, both staring at the shadow of a tree. That's when she realized what was happening. The tiger wanted to save her from those wild animals, so she thanks him. Thinking back a bit earlier, maybe that little tiger in front of her was the thing that had been watching her earlier while she was still with Surai and Begayul, but she didn't understand how he could copy her shape. Did he have special powers because he was a magical beast? 8 years earlier, the Black Turtle clan allied with an evil ancestor and unleashed monsters that corrupted all the lands of the north. Now, these monsters were known as magical beasts. The clan leader, Hayan Rabek, attacked the empire with their help, leaving the continent thrown into chaos. In response, the emperor called forth warriors from every family and declared war on the north. When that happened, her older brother, San Yu, had also been taken. Thinking about it now, she remembers that the eldest son of the White Tigers, Pekaya, was also on the battlefield, but that thing in front of her was fascinating, a magical beast. She'd only ever seen them in stories when she was younger. This was the first time she'd seen one in person. Rumors said these beasts were dangerous and you had to be careful, but that adorable little thing didn't seem bad at all. That's when she asked how the little one had ended up there, formally introducing herself as Soya. The girl explains he'd be in great danger if he stayed there, because maybe someone would mistake the little creature for an evil beast and try to actually hurt him, like they'd done to her. He didn't seem to understand much, which saddens our girl a bit. Noticing the tears forming on her face, he tries to draw in the sand, writing Seolyo, and the fact that he could write it all is enough to surprise the protagonist. It was really nice to know the little creature's name, but she still didn't know what to do. She'd told Hoyeonjung she'd be back before sunset, and it was already setting. Meanwhile, at the palace, Seo had gone to see Jukaihan, asking if he was okay. And the boy smiles, saying it had been a while since they'd seen each other, but he ended up confusing her with Saiha, which left her a bit uncomfortable. And the young man makes a comment about her needing to use her real title so people wouldn't think she was really interested in the room at the end of the east hallway, something the little girl agrees with. Anyway, she'd come to give news about something her father had told her, even though Jokgayan wasn't really listening. He couldn't think of anything besides the sad expression he'd caused on Soya's face. Maybe he should have been a bit kinder. Thinking about it, he ended up looking for the girl at the window again. She usually walked around that time too. Now that he'd stopped to think about it, actually, he hadn't seen even a shadow of the protagonist that whole day, and a dark thought invaded his head, making him get up immediately, leaving the girl a bit confused. He ends up letting his thoughts spill out, saying he couldn't believe that just because of what he'd said earlier, the little girl had left the White Tiger Palace, leaving the girl very confused. So the boy walks off through the hallways, leaving his servant very confused as to why he'd suddenly changed his behavior like that, and he explains he couldn't find the girl anywhere and needed to know where she'd gone. It became clear to the young man he was talking about the cotton ball, and Jukkain comments she should already have gone on her usual walk, but instead, he couldn't find her anywhere. Actually, now that he thought about it, he hadn't seen her at any point that day, not on her morning walk, nor even during afternoon playtime. Finally, they find Hoyeon-jung, who's startled by the young master's sudden entrance into her room, and he immediately asks where Soya was, to which she answers she'd gone for a walk on Mount Horim earlier and still hadn't come back. But she says she should be fine because it wasn't a dangerous mountain, and she'd gone with Baekgayul and Suri. She just hadn't counted on Suri showing up right at that moment. The woman questions why he was there and where the young lady and her companion were. Then, the boy explains he'd had a terrible stomachache and Soya and Baekgayul had promised to stay together, so he'd ended up running down quickly. His answer doesn't seem to please Jekgayan much, who scowls, saying he'd go fetch her himself. The servants even try to talk him out of it, calling after him, saying they knew he cared about the little girl, but maybe that reaction was a bit too much. Except their conversation is interrupted when the woman notices Baekgayul's presence there, but something was very strange. He was alone, with no sign of the protagonist at all. His face looked completely desperate, and he asks if Jukgahan had by chance run into Soya, to which he answers she'd gone with him to climb the mountain, so he didn't know why he was even asking. The little one was visibly nervous, poor thing, not knowing what to do. His expression was enough for Jukgahan to understand what was going on, but even so, he explains the two of them had been playing hide and seek, and he'd ended up falling asleep while hiding, but when he woke up, he couldn't find either Soya or Suri. He couldn't even smell her, so he'd assumed the girl had gone back down the mountain. His brother yells at him, saying he was an idiot for just abandoning her up there, and that makes the poor guy start crying. Which didn't help at all, because Jukgayan kept insisting on knowing why he was crying, since he was the one who'd caused the whole situation. The middle brother seemed angrier than ever before. As the day faded, they climbed the mountains in search of Soya. And the servants tried to cheer Baekgayul up a bit, saying he didn't need to worry, that they were sure the little girl was safe, since the animals on Mount Horim were gentle, and it wasn't anything too dangerous. She'd probably just gotten lost along the way. However, Jukgayan knew something was wrong. He couldn't smell Soya at all, which meant something or someone was blocking their reunion. That's when they're surprised by Juk Ga-hyun transforming into his beast form, saying he'd go find her alone, and ordering everyone to go back to the palace immediately. It was already late at night when they finally managed to start the search. And our little girl was still with Sulyo, commenting she was sure the youngest master would manage to find her thanks to his sense of smell. But maybe that mountain was just too big for him to actually do that. The little girl lets out a sneeze, commenting it was very cold that night. That's when she noticed the sachet Seo had given her had fallen. However, something caught her attention about that object. However, she couldn't pay much attention to it because the little tiger sneezed right beside her, and she asked if he was cold too, moving closer to warm him up. And that drives Sulyo wild, his face flushed with embarrassment. The girl, on the other hand, didn't seem to be feeling well at all. He jumps out of her lap, leaving Soya a bit confused, but the girl doesn't move, just watches him, until he comes back with some tree leaves in his hand, tucking himself under them like a little tent, and miming as if he was saying that was for the two of them to sleep. He wraps the little one in one of the leaves, and that cheers her up, making Soya ask if he'd gone to fetch that because he'd noticed she was cold. The protagonist thanks him enormously. She seemed really happy to have a companion there with her. She'd probably be much more scared if she were completely alone. She even managed to let out a little laugh in the middle of all that despair. Even so, she didn't quite know what to do. She couldn't just leave, and she felt bad for not having been able to keep the one promise she'd made Hoyeon-jung about coming back before sunset. Not only that, but she hadn't managed to grab the flowers she'd gathered for the second young master, which had been the whole point of going out in the first place. A noise catches her attention, making her shiver completely. Was it another wild animal? She couldn't handle that. Sulyo growled quickly at the noise, and the leaves rustled with the wind until she realized it wasn't a wild animal. Those were footsteps, human footsteps. Had the people from the White Tiger Palace finally found her? Or worse, if it wasn't them, who could it be? She couldn't die. She didn't want to die. Someone shouts her name, and the girl faces her pursuer with tears in her eyes, except that she recognized that voice. It was Juk Ga-hyun, who came to her, hugging her tightly, desperate over the girl. His presence there was a surprise, as was all that physical closeness, which wasn't like him at all. She also noticed the boy was trembling, as if he was scared to death. She didn't quite know what to do in that situation, and neither did Sulyo, who seemed a bit scared. She finally breaks the silence, apologizing, asking if she'd caused a big commotion because of her disappearance, and that leaves him indignant, making Juk Ga-hyun hold the girl's hands and ask how she could say such a thing at that moment. Her hands were colder than ever, but he lets his guard down and answers that the girl was right. He was scared to death. Of course it wasn't because of her, but because of himself. She'd been alone on that huge mountain, and he hadn't been able to find her. He'd been afraid he was really incompetent, just wandering around aimlessly, and he apologized for having arrived so late. Juk Ga-hyun used his own cloak to wrap around our girl to protect her from the cold. So, the two of them walked back, with Soya on the little master's back. She'd already said she could walk down herself, but even so, he made it clear he was the one who was worried, and it was dark, so she might end up tripping. His back was very warm, very much like her father's. Along the way, Juk Ga-hyun apologized once more for having taken so long. He'd wanted to get there sooner, but it had taken a while. There'd been some strange barrier along the way that he'd needed to break through. Until, finally, he realized that little black tiger had been following them for a while already, which made him think maybe the barrier had been Sulyo's doing, his face filling with anger. Realizing what might happen, the little girl jumped in beforehand, saying that wasn't an evil creature, and that, actually, she'd been attacked by evil beasts and had been saved by the little tiger. But the fact that those mountain beasts had tried to attack her left Juk Ga-hyun intrigued. So, she explained the whole story. She didn't quite know what to do. Suri had told her to stay close to Baek Gayul the whole time, so he'd probably be mad that she hadn't managed to keep that promise. However, Juk Ga-hyun's silence had nothing to do with that, and when he broke it again, it was to ask if the girl was hurt anywhere, if she'd been bitten, if she was sure she was okay, to which the girl answers yes. In fact, Nam San-ho had given her a magic gem, so she'd manage one way or another. He laments, though, the fact that the girl had probably been scared by the situation. That does surprise Soya. It had been a night full of surprises. However, she notices a small tear in the little boy's sleeve and wonders if maybe he'd gotten hurt while looking for her. But she couldn't ask because Juk Ga-hyun wanted to bring up something very important. He needed to talk to her about what happened yesterday, even though he was a bit bothered by Sulyo following them. Except, since Soya had already said he was harmless, she could ignore that for a while. Getting back to the topic, he comments that when he said stupid little stone, he was talking about his servant's thick head. That definitely had nothing to do with the talisman. Speaking of talisman, he questions if she hadn't come to see him to deliver a new one, saying the little stone she'd given him before was getting a little lonely, but now it'd have a partner. The girl asks if the boy hadn't thrown it away, and he answers with another question, wanting to know why he'd do that. He hadn't known it was a talisman because the servant hadn't said anything. He was starting to get a little troubled by his own feelings. So, he apologized and decided to just tell the truth. Everything he'd said had just been an excuse, treating her coldly when she was already going through a very hard time at the palace, and saying so many bad things, ignoring all the effort she'd been putting in. In the end, it had all been his fault, and he asked if it was possible that the girl forgive him. But, to his surprise, Soya answered she wasn't upset. Sure, the day before had been a little sad for her, but now everything was fine, really. Besides, he'd run out just to save her, so she felt like she needed to thank him, which surprises Jekka-hyun, who smiles a bit sheepishly, assuring her that wouldn't be the last time he'd come running to her. As they got closer to the castle, the boy asked her to stop calling him young master and start calling him Ora Bion. His steps were slow, and the girl gave no answer because she'd already fallen asleep on his back. However, to her surprise, when he opened the gates, he found his father, and his face lit up, saying he'd already heard everything and thanking the boy for the amazing job he'd done guarding the palace while he was away. Baeksayan offers to carry the cotton ball to her room, since it would be quite heavy for the little boy, but she ended up mumbling, calling Jekka-hyun brother in the meantime, which only made it more adorable and made him decline the offer. He wanted to carry her to her room himself. That, indeed, was a surprise for the patriarch, who lets out a sincere little laugh. Apparently, the two of them had gotten quite close during the time he'd been away, and the young man just watches his son carefully carrying the little girl up the stairs. The scene was, indeed, very cute, but something catches his attention. What was that black tiger doing there? Inside, Seo watches Soya's return from behind the door. She didn't know what was so special about that girl, who wasn't even a tiger. The tigers from the associated families were idiots or had zero interest in being adopted, so she was sure that room would be hers. She'd never thought some random little brat would be an obstacle. What would happen if Baeksayan really tried to adopt her? If she lost the room at the end of the hallway to her, that would be the end of her. Her distress is interrupted when someone asks if things weren't going exactly as planned. It was the three-legged crow right in front of her, which startled the girl a bit. She hears from behind the door Baekgaya saying it was a little strange that the beasts of Mount Horim had tried to attack a person, since that wasn't like them. And, afraid of being exposed, Seo quickly closes the door and asks what had happened, since the man had promised that Sachet would get rid of anyone. She'd done everything the crow had told her to, and even so, things seemed to be even worse. However, the young man explains that sometimes unexpected variables show up. Even so, the girl comments that everyone in that palace had been searching for the girl all day. At this rate, she'd be adopted by the family even faster. However, the guy tells her not to worry too much, because that wasn't going to happen. Luckily for her, he knew very well what Soya's weakness was, and just the possibility of knowing that valuable information makes the wicked little girl's eyes light up. When our girl woke up the next day, she was a bit surprised that everyone was looking for her, and worried about her condition. And Ho Yeon-jung explains of course they were, because even on Mount Horim, it got cold and very dark at night, so everyone had been worried she might be out there shivering all alone. And the other servant adds, it was really a relief to see the girl wasn't hurt. She apologizes for having worried everyone. Apparently, this had been a huge deal. And Nam Sun-ho says she didn't need to apologize for anything, that he'd already scolded Suri for not having protected her the previous night. Looking around, the little girl notices something different. It was Baek-gayul, who was leaning against one of the tree branches outside her window. He wasn't trying to spy or anything. He just wanted to know if the girl had woken up. It took less than 5 seconds for tears to roll down his eyes and for him to apologize, since, like an idiot, he hadn't even managed to protect her. Quickly, he transformed into the scared little tiger he was and ran off, hearing the girl's shouts. She asks him not to cry, that everything was fine and she'd come back safely. But there was nothing to be done. That child definitely needed to learn a lesson. Of course, that's what Jekka-hyun thought too. He'd come to see how the girl was doing as well. A vase with some blue flowers decorated the table the two of them shared, and the boy questions if she'd really gone to the mountain just to give him that. And the girl explains she'd heard he liked those flowers, so she wanted to give him a gift he'd actually like. He felt a bit embarrassed for having been so jealous and having hurt the girl with his words, now that he knew her true intentions. However, he made it clear the two of them had made a deal the day before. A deal that, if she needed anything, she'd call him, not Baek-gayul, which leaves her a little surprised. She hadn't known he was being serious. But she soon smiled, assuring him that from then on he'd be her new adventure partner. She just hadn't expected Baek-gayul to be listening and start a scene, asking why Soya was calling that grumpy little boy brother. After all, he wanted to be her brother and could ask for it and beg without any shame at all. But Jekka-hyun quickly put an end to the show, asking what kind of brother couldn't even protect his own sister. All he'd managed to do was make a scene. He was a disgrace to the tiger race, honestly. And, nervous, the boy said he'd better get up off the floor right now, because he was starting to embarrass himself there. He only stopped arguing when Soya did something that caught his attention. She was laughing and commented she just realized her brother didn't say those mean things to her because he didn't like her, even though Baek-gayul disagreed and said Jekka-hyun was actually a terrible tiger who always chose the meanest words in the world to say. Taking the chance since they were talking about tigers, the protagonist questions what had happened to the little creature that had protected her the day before. Then he explains that thing had followed him to a certain point and disappeared, which was a surprise to her. Maybe he'd gone back up the mountain, and if that was the case, she hoped it would be for the best, since by attracting so much attention from people, she knew he could end up getting hurt for being a magical beast. Getting a bit more serious, the boy asks if anyone else knew about the plan the two of them had to climb the mountain the day before besides the two of them, because there was something still very suspicious in the air. First, that the beasts of Mount Horim, who were usually super gentle, had turned violent, tried to find her, and her scent had been completely unavailable. She didn't quite know what to think of that, but Jakayan comments it was as if something had deliberately tried to erase all the evidence that she'd been there. So he questioned if anyone had given her any suspicious item as a gift or something like that. She knew it had to do with that fragrance she'd gotten from Seo. She was sure that had made the beasts turn violent and erased Soya's scent. Apparently, the girl really was interested in the room at the end of the hallway. Even if she pretended otherwise, she must really hate the protagonist. Alone with her thoughts, she didn't know whether or not she should share this with her new brother, and what if he got in danger because of her. But she wasn't going to be able to think about it much longer, because someone called out to her, pulling the girl out of her own head. It was Aring, who wanted to know if she was okay, since she'd heard she'd gotten into some trouble the day before. She even cursed poor Bakayul, saying he was very stupid for having left a small, weak little girl like her alone, which makes Soya laugh a little. She explains the young master was a good person. Even though Aring hated hearing her say those things, she didn't need to be around that guy if she didn't want to. She knew he could be a pain. The girl asks her not to hate the young masters too much. Besides, she made it clear her stay there wouldn't last much longer, and that does manage to surprise the little girl. What did she mean it wouldn't last? Why wouldn't it last? Well, she explains the room's new owner would arrive soon, and she'd have to clear out before that. Aurang looks a bit surprised, but an idea comes to her mind. She could come with her, and that surprises Soya more than anything has in a long time. The little girl argues that she was small and white and not a tiger, but she didn't seem like a bad kid, so it'd be great for her. If she said she was her friend, everyone at her palace would welcome her warmly. At the Brown Tiger Estate, there was a very big lake, and they could swim, fish, and could even go to the mountain together. She wouldn't have to sleep alone. Of course, there were some idiot tigers like Baekgayul there too, but that didn't matter. Aurang made it clear she could protect the girl and no one would ever mess with her again, and, with a sincere smile, asked her to come to her house. That leaves our girl quite emotional, and Soya thanks her. She thought that, since Aurang and Baekgayul were on somewhat better terms now, if she accepted the invitation, maybe she could even visit the White Tiger Palace occasionally. But the two girls' conversation is interrupted by the arrival of another person, a girl with black hair and red clothes, Sahe, from the Black Tiger clan. The girl was definitely having a very bad day to be wearing that sour face. Aurang comments the girl always said she'd marry Baekgaya, but if she were adopted by the White Tiger clan, she and he would become siblings, so that'd be kind of impossible. Either way, that must be why Seo had been acting all high and mighty as usual, since neither Sahe nor she had the slightest intention of becoming members of the family. She'd already acted like she owned that room even before the competition started, which makes the protagonist understand a few things. Either way, she goes back to the conversation about her house, saying that when the two of them went, she'd teach the girl some self-defense, because she wasn't going to survive on a pretty face alone. A little tiger catches Soya's attention, who quickly stands up, leaving Aurang a bit confused because she'd seemed pretty invested in her speech. However, the girl explains she had to be somewhere for a moment and couldn't continue the conversation right now. She calls the tiger's attention, saying so. That was him then, calling out for Seayo, who's very happy to hear his name. The little girl warns that it was very dangerous for him down there, and suggests he go back up the mountain soon, which makes the poor thing cry. And even though she tried to explain that if people saw him like that, it wouldn't look good, someone approaches and comments that apparently the girl was making friends with people who hadn't even been introduced to him yet. It was Baek-san, who had a very serious look on his face watching the scene. That leaves our girl a bit uneasy, because it meant he knew about the tiger's existence and would surely think he was some evil demonic beast. She worried a little that the young man might hurt her new friend, who was already very important to her. A bit nervous, the girl explains that the tiger in question was just a child and wasn't evil, but Baek-san tells her not to even worry about that, since he had no intention at all of hurting her friend. Besides, he was the one who'd brought him there in the first place, actually, about 7 years ago. Curious, the protagonist questions if maybe he'd stolen that little creature just like he'd stolen from the Red Bird clan, something the young man confirms, which is a bit of a surprise to her. Noticing she was looking around desperately, Baek-san asks what had happened, and the girl explains it'd be bad if someone overheard the two of them talking, because if rumors spread about him stealing things like it was nothing, something might happen. That's when he remembered the two of them had had that same conversation when he went to steal her, and he recalled that the little one was still responsible for keeping his secret. Something he definitely didn't need to worry about, because that little girl was one of the most loyal people he'd ever known. He changes the subject a bit, saying he had something more important to talk to her about, actually, and picks her up in his arms, commenting she'd gotten a bit heavier. Soya seems a bit desperate at that information about her weight and it being up in the air, and asked him to put her down, but it was all just teasing from Baek-san. After all, the girl was as light as a feather. He was sure that if you blew on her, she'd fly away. So, actually, he hoped she'd gain some weight. Soya could only turn redder and redder like a ripe tomato, while the young man said it'd be good for them to fatten her up a bit. Turning to Solyo, the boy explains he'd take her real quick and then come back, telling the magical beast to stay out of everyone else's sight. The two of them sit at the table, and the young man explains he'd heard the whole story from yesterday, from Chuk Ga-hyun. It must have been very scary, but he thanked the girl for having come home with such courage. She didn't know if she should really be thanked for anything, since she hadn't really done much work. Actually, she'd come back on her brother's back. Even so, she thanked him and apologized for having made him worry unnecessarily. Her words leave the man rather stunned. He makes it clear that he was the one who should apologize, not her. He'd brought the girl to his palace and hadn't managed to protect her. Except in Soya's mind, that wasn't quite how it was. Ever since she'd arrived there, even on the days she was sick, he'd been protecting her nonstop. However, the man counters, saying that if they were going to look at things that way, it was actually she who'd protected the palace from terrible ghosts, protected him and that old fox Juk-young, and Nam San-ho and Ho Yeon-jung too. In fact, he didn't have enough fingers on both hands to count how many people she'd helped in that time, and that's why Baek-san thanked her sincerely for protecting the White Tiger Palace. After the meal, the girl walked through the halls. She was thinking that, since Arang and Sahe didn't want to be adopted, Seo would probably really become part of the White Tiger family and live at the palace. If she told anyone what had happened with that little sachet she'd received, it would put her in a very bad spot, and she didn't want to be a burden to anyone else. She just needed to stay quiet, since she was already about to leave that place anyway. Her walk was interrupted by a voice she recognized a little. It was Seo, saying she'd been looking for her, but apparently had found her sooner than expected. The protagonist still didn't quite know how to respond, but decided to just spit it out and said she had something to talk to her about the sachet she'd gotten as a gift. Laughing, Seo comments the girl wasn't as dumb as she seemed, and our girl doesn't waste time and asks if she'd really been trying to hurt her on purpose, which the girl confirms, but wanted to know if that would be a problem between the two of them. She didn't seem the least bit hesitant to be cruel, and got closer to the girl, saying she'd heard that. Actually, Soya was nothing but a sinner who'd stolen someone else's life, asking if by chance the girl was trying to steal her rightful place too. And our girl denies it, desperately. That hadn't been her intention. Then the little girl says it'd be better for her to leave, in that case, because if she didn't leave the palace right that moment, she'd let everyone know she was nothing but a thief, so she'd better pack her things and leave before that. Her words leave Soya completely frozen. As soon as the palace people heard about her true identity, about how she was just a weak little bird, they'd turn their backs on her, just like the Red Bird clan had done, which fills her eyes with tears. Hopeful, she asks if she could at least say goodbye to Baek-sayan before leaving, at least to thank him, but Seo was sure that was just an excuse to drag out her stay and steal her place, the room at the end of the east hallway. She couldn't even stand the thought of a rat like Soya staying there for even one more day, so it'd be better to get out of there that night without telling anyone, because if she was still there the next day, Seo would make a point of exposing her secret to everyone. It didn't take long for night to fall, and our girl was alone in her room looking at the gift she'd gotten from Baek-sayun. She'd thought that at least she'd managed to thank the people who'd taken care of her before leaving. She never thought her identity would be exposed and she'd have to flee like that, but there was no way around it. It was time to go. However, as she passed by her window with her little bundle of clothes, she noticed something outside. It was Cielyo, more excited than ever, who knocked the girl to the ground out of sheer joy at seeing her, even though she warned him she had to leave. But of course the tiger wouldn't leave her alone. He wanted to go with her, and that offer manages to leave the protagonist even more emotional. She hugs the little bear tightly, saying she hadn't thought she'd feel less alone now that she had his company. In her thoughts, she thanked Baek-sayan for everything he'd done for her, looking at the palace she was about to leave with tears in her eyes. However, a pink cloud enveloped her, a scent she recognized, the scent of the sachet that had driven the magical beasts crazy. But why was she smelling that scent from the other tigress's quarters? It made no sense at all. That's when she remembered tomorrow would be the mountain festival. Even so, it made no sense. She stared at Orang's and Sahe's palanquins with tremendous seriousness and opened one of them to make sure there really was a sachet inside, but she didn't know what it was doing there. The same sachet Seo had given her, but why? Neither Orang nor Sahe had any interest in that stupid room. So why was the silver tigress trying to hurt people? She remembered her evil face, saying that if she didn't obey, she'd reveal her secret to everyone. She didn't want everyone to see her as a bad person again, but even so, she couldn't help it. She remembered Baeksayan thanking her for protecting the White Tiger Palace, and she'd hate it far more if innocent people got hurt just because she did nothing. She was determined to stop Lady Seo from hurting anyone at all. So she got an idea and called Seonyo, asking if he was really strong, like strong enough to fight against animated beasts, because if that was really the case, she needed his help, and of course the little guy wouldn't refuse. Meanwhile, Jak Gahyun was in his office reading books, but his mind was far away, on the conversation he'd had with Soya earlier that day, when he asked if anyone else had known they were going up the mountain the day before, to which she answered she wasn't sure, actually. The boy didn't say anything at the time, but he was quite thoughtful. It seemed like the girl had an idea of who might have set up that whole mess, but she was such a sweet kid, she probably couldn't bring herself to snitch on anyone. That's why he was determined to find the culprit and settle that mess, because it was his job as the older brother. He'd investigated the mountain immediately, but the only footprints he'd found on the ground had been from the girl's own group. And there was no way either Bak Gayul or Suri would do something like that. Someone had brought a cursed object with black magic up the mountain. That's what had made the wild beasts go so out of control, and it had also masked Soya's natural scent. What made no sense was that everyone there at the White Tiger Palace loved the girl very much. They collectively called her Cotton Ball and everything. So, of all of them, the only person who might want to get rid of the girl was, without a doubt, an outsider. Finally, his servant arrives with the item he'd requested, a stone fired in the kiln, and the speed surprises him. It was a stone engraved with Soya's face, which made him very happy. The object reminds him he'd gotten so caught up in this whole story during the day that he hadn't managed to see the girl at all. Now he had the perfect excuse. So he knocked at her room, and the lack of response made him think maybe she was already asleep. But even so, he decided to go in, only to get a shock realizing there was no one there. The problem is, there was no reason for the girl to have simply left her room so late. That hit Jak Gahyun's chest right away. He was sure someone had taken her. He runs quickly to another room, running into Seo and her maid, who asks what the boy was doing there so late at night. He clenches his fist with great anger, making the girl's eyes go wide, while he grips her shoulders, insisting on knowing where the hell Soya was. The girl pushes him away, asking why he was looking for that girl there, and Jae-Gaham makes it clear he knew she was behind all of it, questioning if by chance she thought he was dumb enough to never figure it out. Even so, Seo plays dumb, saying she didn't know what that girl had told him, but she had no idea what he was talking about, and she's backed up by her maid, who shouts that she was right, that confronting the poor girl over some stubborn brat was absurd. But Jokayan wouldn't allow anyone to call his sister a stubborn brat, making it clear Soya was his father's honored guest. And on top of that, he almost let slip that she was his sister. He didn't know if he could call her that yet, actually, so he stopped himself. The servants soon crowded into the room to find out what the commotion was about, and one of them explains he'd come out because of the noise and had run into the second Grand Master. Baeksayan shows up in surprise, excusing himself and asking what all that noise was about so late. Stammering, Nam Sanho can only greet his father, who approaches the girl and explains Soya had disappeared again. He couldn't sense her scent anywhere and was sure the Silver Tiger clan had done something. He hadn't even finished asking when a flashy girl burst into the room asking, "What do you mean Soya disappeared again?" since she'd promised she'd go with her to her palace. Curious, Chagayan asks what she meant by going with her. Then the girl explains they'd talked earlier, and the little girl had said she couldn't stay much longer because the room's true owner would be arriving, so she'd agreed to follow Arang wherever she went. The fact that she'd said something like that ends up surprising Jagahyun and Peksahan, who look totally shaken by that reality. Even so, he wanted to understand what his son meant by "this is the Silver Tiger clan's fault," and Nam Sanho explains that someone had definitely put a target on Soya's back and used black magic to lure her up that mountain and drive the wild beasts crazy. And the only family with access to that kind of magic, and who'd benefit from the girl's disappearance, was the Silver Tigers. Seo shouts that he needed to stop with those crazy accusations without any proof, because if he was going to suspect her, he should suspect the other families too. Arang and Sahe had also gone to the mountain festival, trying to get the room at the end of the hallway. But Arang quickly defends herself, saying she'd only gone there because her mother made her. She didn't care about any room. Even so, the girl keeps saying that thing about the beasts going crazy could just be a lie from the protagonist. Those creatures were known for being very gentle. Her speech was interrupted by something else. The ground was shaking beneath them, and there was some very strange noise rumbling around the palace, until one of the servants arrived, shouting that they needed to get out right now, because something had happened to the protagonist. Baeksayan didn't even hear the rest. He was already running, but she was being hunted down by absolutely furious wild beasts. As soon as he got outside, he was already shouting for the girl, who called back to him, quite shocked, and told him to run away right now. The girl rode on that huge wolf while being chased by the others. That was all perfect. The beasts had managed to catch the scent of the sachay's essence and were now chasing her, instead of chasing the other girls. When she'd been much younger, and even smaller than now, she'd seen one of their servants get fired for having plotted against her family. She'd cried about it, and her father ended up giving her a lecture. Chuck Ayon explains she had to be capable of pointing out when people had done wrong. It wasn't bad to discern who was bad and show that to other people, especially considering that, as a direct descendant of the Redbird line, she had a duty to protect the baby birds of the South. She knew hurting others was wrong, that she couldn't sympathize with bad people. Even if her own father had been the one to kick her out of her home, she knew what he'd said was very genuine, and she was sure Baeksayan wouldn't disagree with that kind of behavior, because he was someone trustworthy, who liked protecting other people. Her run continues until she runs into the young man, and mentally thanks that everyone was there outside, because if they'd seen the agitated beasts with their own eyes, they'd believe her. However, she didn't quite know what to do now that she'd reached this point. Honestly, she hadn't thought she'd managed to do much. Maybe that's why all she could say to Baeksayan was for him to run. Of course he didn't do that. Instead, he put himself in front of his little protected girl against all those beasts and ordered them back with priceless seriousness, turning all of them into helpless, frightened animals, making that legion of wolves run back to where they'd come from. Soya sighs in relief, and the young man carries her carefully once again, before shaking the girl in the air a little and asking what she was doing out of her room in such a dangerous situation at that hour. She couldn't even find an explanation. And Soya just showed him the scent sachet she'd received from Seo. The girl was sweating cold in front of him, but even so, the protagonist kept saying she'd taken it to Mount Horam, and that's when this whole thing happened with the beasts, them starting to chase her out of nowhere. Baekgayon shouts that sachet had been given by Seo earlier, before they left. The little girl continues, saying she'd smelled that same scent from the other girls' palanquins and had gotten worried. She thought that if things stayed as they were, worse things would happen the next day, so she'd wanted to warn everyone. But she knew that without proof, no one would believe her. And, speaking of proof, her speech is interrupted by that insufferable girl who shouts that it was all a lie. Even in the southern lands, that girl had stolen someone's place. She was a criminal who stole and then ran. She pointed her finger at Soya, making it clear she was a liar and that no one should believe her words. The girl says the Redbird clan tried to keep everything hushed up because it wouldn't look good, but everyone there knew. She'd stolen the position of the clan's first daughter and had been kicked out after pretending to be that child. Because of that, she had absolutely no right to be there, and now she was scheming against her just so she could keep the room at the end of the east hallway. Soya was scared, but she was ready for that. She knew that if she told the truth, Seo would expose her in front of everyone, but if she just pretended nothing had happened and someone got hurt, it would surely be far more tragic. She couldn't just pretend she didn't know what would happen the next day if she left the sachets there. So she handed the sachets to Baeksayan and explained they'd been found in the other girls' palanquins. They had the same scent as the sachet she'd received from Seo when she went up the mountain. That leaves the young man rather worried. He questions if she'd really smelled the scent of those things, and the girl confirms, a bit confused. That's when she realized no one else there could smell anything at all, and Seo took the chance to say there was actually no scent there at all, arguing the girl was a liar. Seriously, what an idiotic girl. To her, those little wraps had no scent at all. Baeksayan calls for Jukyoung and orders him to take them to his sister Sarah for her to examine what was in them. He knew she'd managed to find something, and that indeed manages to worry Seo, because she had to find a way to become a direct descendant of the White Tiger clan, otherwise her parents would keep treating her like a useless little thing. Her maid catches the patriarch's attention, saying he couldn't just listen to Soya's side and not listen to anyone else. Even if Seo really had threatened her, he couldn't punish a member of the Silver Tiger clan because of some nobody whose origins weren't even known. Sharply, he asked who had said that, because that child wasn't a nobody. She was his child, whom he himself had brought there. The woman explains she knew that they knew she was a guest, but even so, it wasn't enough. Except Baeksayan makes it clear they weren't understanding what he was saying and pulls Soya's little hand, reaffirming she was his child, not a guest or anything like that. His child, which leaves our girl very emotional. The two of them go inside, and Jukyoung talks a little with his sister, saying it'd be good for the two of them to wait around there for a bit, to give it some time and process everything. Downcast, Soya thanks him. But the boy finds the distance odd, since she'd called him young master again, and not brother like the day before. So, to not leave the discomfort just in his own head, Jukyoung asks if he'd done something. He'd heard the whole story from Lady Arang about how she was planning to leave the palace, but he wanted to understand why she was trying to abandon them so easily. So he questioned if it was because of the bad things and having treated her badly, but the protagonist already denies it. Before she could continue her speech, he calls her attention, saying she was calling him young master again, but the girl just says it was because she wasn't used to calling him brother. She could have kept talking, but her eyes go wide, seeing the scene in front of her. Juk Ga-hyun had tears in his eyes and kept apologizing nonstop, apologizing because he didn't want her to leave, and begged her to come live there with them, at the White Tiger Palace, for good. However, the girl explains she worried that, if she stayed, she'd end up making things uncomfortable for Seo. The two children are surprised when the door opens and Soya stares, eyes brimming with tears, at the image of Baek Sayon, who asks if she really had been planning to leave and abandon them like that. She didn't know how to explain that she didn't really want to leave, but she had no choice, so she just confirmed his suspicion. But honestly, she was happy that at least she could say goodbye. Except Baek Sayon surprised her, saying that wasn't going to happen. He would definitely not allow it, at the very least, and he reminded the protagonist that she herself had said he could steal her, so he had. She couldn't just change her mind and decide to run away. However, the girl explains that in his speech, he'd said she could stay for a while. The young man was already ready to argue back until he remembered he really had said the girl could stay in that room, at least for now. That's when he realized what was happening. He'd acted like a really silly tiger, and he knelt down in front of the cotton ball to say that it was all his fault, really. The girl is horrified that he was on his knees, but the young man continues his speech, saying he'd made her anxious because he hadn't managed to give the girl the security she needed. But he promised, right then, that he'd never let her feel that way again. He'd become a better adult, just for her. And he made it clear that it wasn't for now, but he wanted her to stay at the palace with him forever. It was a shock for Soya to realize he wasn't disappointed in her, and an even bigger shock for Baek Sayon, who didn't understand why he would be, to begin with. Even so, the girl insists, explaining that, like Lady Seo said, she was a bad child who'd stolen something that belonged to someone else. Even he had been disappointed in her, so she was already expecting what was coming. However, the young man makes it clear he'd never be disappointed in her, and if it seemed like he was, it wasn't because of her. Actually, he was disappointed in himself, which surprises our girl even more. He explains he'd failed to notice his honored guest's pain, and that's why he'd been disappointed. That was a bit strange to hear from an adult, especially since, if she was honest, she didn't think the patriarch had done anything wrong. The protagonist knew she was the rotten fruit on the tree, she'd stolen someone's life, and she started sobbing because of it. She'd already gone too far, so she might as well tell the whole story. She told him how people used to say poor Lady Lily had grown up without her parents because of her, that she was weak, and that the clan leader and the young master had suffered it all because of her. To her surprise, the girl was hugged by Baek Sayon, who questioned why any of that would be her fault. Actually, he was full of hatred for those disgusting birdmen. Why had they done such atrocities to a child? He remembered Ho Yeon-jung informing him her body had been covered in scars during her first bath there. Thinking about all of it, he said Soya was only 9 years old and was smaller than other children her age. She still needed to be protected, and he said, in no uncertain terms, that she'd done nothing wrong, that there was nothing wrong with the protagonist. She didn't understand why anyone would stand by her side, since this was the first time in 9 years that anyone had done that, to which the young man answers there was something very wrong with the world they lived in. So he'd show her how life was really supposed to be, and, in no uncertain terms, he asked her to become his daughter, making Soya's eyes go wide with shock and hope. Jugyoung found him afterward in his chambers, a bit wary, having seen that his master had really done what he'd predicted. But for Baek Sayon, that had sort of been destined to happen since the moment he'd stolen the girl and brought her to the White Tiger Palace. Maybe that's how having a daughter was supposed to feel. In fact, she'd been crying quite a lot earlier, kept repeating that she wasn't a tiger, and didn't have strong teeth or strong legs. Of course, no bird would have those traits. But Yeogyung knew his master had managed to comfort her, even though Baek Sayon didn't think it was really comfort. Honestly, he had no wings, his personality was terrible, and he wasn't cute, so he asked if the girl would really want a father like him, being scolded even by Baek Ga-hyun, who said his father was going to make the girl cry again with those words. Either way, the servant was happy that things were falling into place, at least for now, which leaves the master a bit suspicious. After all, the girl hadn't said no. Except Jugyoung argues the girl was fragile, and there were many duties for a direct descendant of the house, so the cotton ball could get hurt. He knew that was going to happen, and, if he was honest, he thought the protagonist was better than the other girls within the tiger clans, because Lady Sarah said those sachets had been made by the hands of some magic sorcerer from the north, but now they had to figure out what to do about the Silver Tiger clan's child. Baek Sayon really didn't have an answer for that. To qualify as a candidate for the Yellow Dragon's bride, the girl needed to be part of the White Tiger clan, and he didn't think such a young child would want that on her own. He calls the servant by his full name, which makes even his spine shiver. He got nervous when his tone dropped like that, but Baek Sayon smiles, saying he'd been thinking a lot. It was strange to put those young little girls up to compete for the position of direct descendant just because of some ridiculous tradition, like the Yellow Dragon's bride. However, the servant explains that position was only for direct descendants. But the master's point wasn't that. It was that there was no need to rank the children. Sure, the descendants' duties were important, but they were just kids. Kids who shone so brightly, just running around with their happy smiles. So he decided to abolish that strange custom from then on. Even if they failed to secure a perfect bride for the Yellow Dragon, his clan wouldn't fall to ruin because of it. Besides, he'd make sure everything was in order for his new daughter. But more important than that scent that no one else could smell left him intrigued, because it made no sense that only the little girl could smell it. That's when Sarah commented there was something different about the protagonist's animal spirit. It was hard to say at that moment, because it was still very damaged, but she sensed a unique energy coming from it. Maybe his sister was right, but that made no sense. According to the rumors, wasn't Soya the daughter of a maid? It was rare for a commoner to have such a special spirit. The next day, the girl could barely open her eyes while the servants watched her, giggling, even though she didn't know why. But they had great news. And Nam San-ho said that from that day on, he'd been officially named her bodyguard, and Ho Yun-jung her official maid, which makes Soya's eyes light up. Once the mountain festival was over, the clan leader would get her good tutors too. They ask the girl to wait for her breakfast for a moment, and she agrees, leaving the little girl alone there. So, it hadn't been a dream. She really had found her family with Baekseon, and that brings tears to her eyes again. That's it, guys! Okay, but does anyone else think this is heading toward a full-on harem dynamic later, or is the author gonna narrow it down eventually? My money's kind of on Baekgahan, honestly. That whole please don't leave breakdown hit different. But Baekhyul is not backing down anytime soon either, lol. And Rim being out there with his own agenda in the background makes me nervous he's gonna complicate things even more once he's older. This has been the White Tiger Clan's Little Fluff, and I made it all the way to chapter 24 for you guys. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to like and subscribe so I can keep bringing you more. Kisses, and see you next time.